Greetings and welcome to Secrets of History at Night. This is a tranquil space where inquisitive minds can comfortably explore, and the profound mysteries of the cosmos unfold at their own pace. Tonight's contemplation is an unusual one, yet it possesses the quality of gently embedding itself in your thoughts, lingering long after the initial encounter. It transcends current events or the latest scientific breakthroughs. Instead, it delves into the kind of question that might surface late at night when the household is hushed and your thoughts drift a little further than their usual confines. The question is this: was the very first civilization to grace Earth truly ours? This might sound like the opening of a science fiction narrative, perhaps involving extraterrestrial visitors or lost continents submerged beneath the waves. However, my intention is far more grounded. Consider the vast expanse of our planet's history, stretching back billions of years. Our entire human saga, every empire, every innovation, every individual you've encountered in historical accounts, occupies but a minuscule fraction of that immense timeline. The remaining epochs are characterized by oceans, volcanic activity, dense forests, and icy landscapes. They are inhabited by creatures we will only ever know through fossilized remains, and perhaps, just perhaps, by something else. Something that possessed the capacity for thought, for planning, and for construction long before the earliest humans grasped their first rudimentary tools. Before we venture further, I'm curious to know your location. Has night already enfolded your surroundings? Or is sunlight currently illuminating your window? You might be in transit, observing the world glide by, or perhaps you're settled in your favorite, most comfortable chair. Wherever and whenever you are, we are connecting in this shared moment to ponder an idea that invites us to envision a world no longer visible. If this journey of quiet contemplation, characterized by a calm, steady, and unhurried curiosity, resonates with you, I would be deeply appreciative if you considered a like, a subscription, or even sharing this with someone who might benefit from some gentle reflection this evening. It's a small gesture, but it significantly aids in allowing these hushed dialogues to reach new listeners. In a way, it's akin to keeping a beacon lit in the window for fellow travelers. Let us commence with a fundamental concept: our planet itself. Not as we perceive it today, but as it existed before any human footstep ever graced its surface. There were no metropolises, no cultivated fields, no thoroughfares, and no voices resembling our own. There were skies, vast expanses of water, and unblemished shorelines that continuously reshaped themselves. Entire mountain ranges emerged and eroded away eons before humanity's arrival. A cartographic representation of the continents from that distant era would bear no resemblance to the maps found in your schoolbooks. Land masses migrated across the planet's crust over millennia, converging, fragmenting, and submerging. It's easy to envision this pre-human Earth as devoid of life, but this was far from the case. It teemed with diverse organisms populating every conceivable space. Some navigated the depths, others soared through the air, and many traversed the forest floor. A multitude of these beings bore no likeness to any living creature of the present day, and among them, it's conceivable that some possessed the nascent stages of what we recognize as intelligence. We often regard human intellect as a singular, unique attribute that distinguishes us from all other species. However, The reality is that intelligence manifests itself in surprising ways throughout the animal kingdom. Corvids and parrots demonstrate problem solving skills. Dolphins exhibit self recognition. Octopuses utilize tools. This is within our current human inhabited world. But what if there was a period when intelligence wasn't merely a sporadic spark in individual organisms, but formed the bedrock of an entire civilization? One that flourished and subsequently vanished before we even existed to bear witness. The inherent challenge lies in Earth's tendency to be a forgetful custodian. It safeguards some secrets for eons, while obliterating others with remarkable speed. A city constructed today, if abandoned, begins its decay within mere decades. Within a few centuries, it might be reduced to overgrown ruins. After a few millennia, its most discernible traces could be entirely erased. Granted, a few million years and geological shifts will have occurred. Weathering will have eroded stone, and rivers and oceans will have altered their courses. Even metals and concrete would degrade, disperse, and become buried beneath subsequent strata. This isn't a deliberate annihilation of evidence, but rather the planet's continuous process of renewal, laying down new layers atop the old. If an earlier civilization had existed millions of years ago, would we possess any awareness of it? We'd like to believe so. We envision archaeologists unearthing stone temples, intricate sculptures, and sophisticated tools. However, this scenario applies to human history because our temporal scope is relatively limited. The most ancient human-built stone structures are approximately 12,000 years old. This is a negligible span when compared to Earth's age. If we attempted to locate evidence from, for instance, 50 million years ago, we would be examining geological formations that were solidifying when that civilization's urban centers were still intact. And those formations have endured considerable transformation since then. They have been subjected to immense pressure, contorted, fractured, and melted. They have been transported vast distances from their original sites. The older the geological layer, the less it retains. This is partly why scientists sometimes discuss the Silurian hypothesis. While its name originates from a work of fiction, the underlying concept is quite serious. It probes whether an industrial civilization could be discernible within the geological record millions of years hence, even in the absence of direct artifacts. Might there be chemical residues, strata containing unusual metals, or alterations in atmospheric composition? Possibly. We are aware that our own industrial activities have already imprinted a signature within ice cores, sedimentary layers, and the faint stratum of radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing. Such markers could persist for millions of years, long after all edifices have crumbled. However, they are subtle and easily overlooked unless one is meticulously searching for them. If this is indeed the case, it presents a peculiar possibility. Perhaps we have already inadvertently passed by faint vestiges of something more ancient, such as a metallic vein in a rock face, or a mineral deposit with an anomalous composition. We might have categorized it as a natural geological feature without ever entertaining the notion that it could be artificial. This is not due to a lack of diligence on the part of scientists, but rather because the concept of a pre-human civilization lies so far outside the conventional spectrum of possibilities that it is not the initial explanation considered. Contemplating this does not necessitate belief in clandestine histories or covert conspiracies. It is fundamentally an exercise in humility. We tend to perceive ourselves as unique, unparalleled, and the apex of life on Earth. Yet we are participants in a far grander narrative, one that is still unfolding and has already witnessed transformations and upheavals beyond our immediate comprehension. We understand that catastrophic extinction events have repeatedly reshaped life. We recognize that ecosystems can emerge and collapse with astonishing rapidity in geological terms. And we know that intelligence is not a linear progression culminating in humanity. Rather, it is a complex, interwoven network that has evolved in myriad directions over time. Therefore, if a civilization predated our own, what might it have been like? This is the question we will begin to explore next. For now, it is sufficient to hold this idea in your mind, to envision the deep past as a realm far richer and more enigmatic than the unpopulated wilderness we sometimes conjure. The continental configurations were not as they are now. The atmosphere might have felt denser, warmer, or colder. The fauna would have been utterly alien. And somewhere within that ancient tableau, perhaps there were beings collaborating, molding their environment, sharing their unique narratives, and then fading into obscurity before we ever had the opportunity to encounter them. Long before individuals existed to record dates, before the advent of calendars or clocks, and even before the very concept of tracking years was conceived, Earth was already ancient. By the time humanity first emerged, the planet had experienced billions of dawns and dusks, sufficient time to erode entire mountain ranges and to elevate new ones from the ocean floor. The continents we recognize on contemporary maps were not stationary. They migrated slowly, colliding, fragmenting, and drifting across the globe like colossal stone rafts upon a molten mantle. Had it been possible to observe Earth from space tens of millions of years ago, its outlines would have been unrecognizable. While blues, greens, and whites from cloud cover would have been present, the shapes of the land masses would have been peculiar, and the arrangement of oceans would have formed patterns entirely novel to our perception. The climate was not perpetually as we experience it today. There were periods when much of the planet was warm and humid, cloaked in verdant forests that extended nearly to the poles. Conversely, there were epochs when ice sheets advanced so far south that even the equator felt the bite of the cold. Sea levels fluctuated repeatedly, inundating coastal plains and subsequently revealing them anew. Entire ecological systems arose and dissipated in cycles that we can only reconstruct through the geological record. Earth has never been static, nor will it ever be. During those immense stretches of time, life permeated virtually every available niche on the planet. The ocean floors teemed with organisms that never experienced sunlight. Coral reefs flourished, perished, and regenerated in new locations. Swamps echoed with the calls of creatures that would be baffling to us without the assistance of fossil evidence. On terrestrial landscapes, forests were populated by trees whose closest modern relatives are long extinct, and beneath their canopies roamed beings of all sizes. Insects were among the earliest inhabitants, firmly established long before the dinosaurs appeared. Birds evolved from diminutive feathered dinosaurs, mastering the aerial currents above the forests. Mammals were also present, though for much of this duration they remained small, often subsisting in the shadows of far larger contemporaneous creatures. If you were to stand within one of those primeval environments, it might initially seem familiar. A tree remains a tree, and water invariably flows downhill. The air would still move in gentle breezes and surge in powerful storms. The sun would continue its ascent in the morning and descend in the night. However, the finer details would be profoundly unfamiliar. The auditory landscape would diverge significantly from what your ears are accustomed to. The flora might bear some resemblance to what you know, or it could appear utterly alien in its morphology, with leaf patterns evolved for climates that no longer exist. The fauna would present a blend of the recognizable and the extraordinary. Some would be ancestors of present day creatures, while others would have left no living descendants. Certain of these species congregated in herds, flocks, and colonies. They communicated through methods now lost to us, employing vocalizations, coloration, or movements that held meaning for them, but are incomprehensible to us now. They engaged in predation, embarked on migrations, and nurtured their young. Many possessed brains capable of complex behaviors, though perhaps not in ways that we would immediately categorize as civilized. Nevertheless, when contemplating the potential for a pre-human civilization, it is here that our minds tend to gravitate. Amidst all those life forms, might there have been one that charted a different course? One that commenced altering its surroundings deliberately, not merely for survival, but for comfort, for aesthetic expression, or to satisfy its innate curiosity. We know that such developments are possible because they occurred with us. Our own trajectory from small hunter-gatherer bands to builders of complex urban centers spanned hundreds of thousands of years. Intelligence did not manifest instantaneously. It was shaped by climatic conditions, geographical features, and the relentless pressures of survival and adaptation. We can surmise that if another species had possessed the requisite combination of faculties, problem-solving prowess, effective communication, and the ability to utilize tools, a similar trajectory could have commenced in the distant past. Not within our temporal framework, but within one of the multitude of timelines that existed before our emergence. The primary impediment is that the historical record from these epochs is incomplete. Fossilization is a rare occurrence contingent upon specific environmental conditions. The majority of organic entities disintegrate without leaving any trace upon death. They are either consumed, decomposed, or simply disperse. Even when skeletal remains are preserved, they offer limited insight into behavior. A skull can indicate the size and shape of a cranial cavity, but not the thoughts that transpired within it. It can suggest modes of locomotion, dietary habits, and lifespan, but not the complexity of cultural practices. Lithic implements and constructed edifices have a greater capacity for preservation, but only if they are entombed in a manner that shields them from erosion and tectonic forces over millions of years. Furthermore, a substantial portion of Earth's surface has undergone continuous recycling. The lithosphere is not an immutable stage, but a dynamic assembly of shifting tectonic plates. Oceans open and close, engulfing ancient seabeds and forming new ones. Mountains are pulverized into sand and gravel, transported by rivers, and deposited as new layers elsewhere. Any evidence of a civilization predating our own would have had to withstand all of these geological processes. The probability of such survival is exceedingly low. Even if such evidence did endure, we would still need to recognize it for what it was: A worked piece of stone dating back tens of millions of years might be dismissed as a natural formation unless it was discovered within the appropriate context. A localized anomaly in chemical composition within a rock stratum might be overlooked unless there was a specific impetus to investigate potential industrial origins. When one considers the sheer magnitude of the temporal scale involved, it becomes more comprehensible how something could vanish almost entirely. Envision an entire continent blanketed in forests, dotted with settlements and metropolises belonging to a species with whom we never shared the planet. Over millions of years, sea levels rise and fall, glaciers advance and retreat, volcanoes erupt, and the very crust of the earth buckles and shifts. Ultimately, almost everything they created would be lost. A few tenacious remnants might persist, perhaps buried deep beneath layers of sediment, or preserved within an ancient seabed now transformed into rock. The remainder would be as if it had never existed. We can identify locations where Earth has retained a memory for an unusually extended duration. Fossilized forests, where trees remain petrified in their original positions. Insects entombed in amber for tens of millions of years. Footprints impressed into mud and preserved until that mud solidified into rock. These are exceptional occurrences, moments in time preserved by uncommon circumstances. For an entire civilization to be so comprehensively documented would necessitate a remarkable convergence of geological fortune and chance. Absent such circumstances, their existence would fade into the same profound silence that has enveloped countless other species. Contemplating this scenario does not compel us to believe it transpired. It merely opens the possibility. And once that door is ajar, it becomes difficult not to speculate on the nature of such a civilization. Would they have existed in vast numbers or in small dispersed communities? Would their constructions have been of stone, wood, or materials prone to rapid decay, leaving little trace? Would they have reshaped the landscape to suit their requirements, or moved in harmony with the seasons, leaving only subtle imprints upon the world? Would their artistic expressions be something we could comprehend? Or would they have been conveyed through colors and forms that possessed meaning exclusively for them? We lack definitive answers, but we possess the faculty of imagination. And imagination often serves as the initial catalyst for discovery. Scientists formulate hypotheses not solely from empirical evidence, but also from conceptual frameworks regarding what evidence to seek. And ideas such as this one, pertaining to the possibility of a pre-human civilization, can fundamentally alter the inquiries we pose when examining the past. Earth has transformed into numerous distinct worlds throughout its existence. Each iteration possessed its own unique climate, its own geological features, and its own assemblage of life. The iteration we inhabit today, with its mosaic of oceans, continents, and polar ice caps, is but one in a lengthy succession. Long before our arrival, dense jungles flourished, where deserts now lie, and ice-covered regions that are now open seas. There existed creatures whose forms we would scarcely recognize, and flora that would appear out of place in any contemporary forest. Amidst all that change, it is not implausible to conceive that intelligence emerged prior, completed its cycle, and then vanished. And if that were the case, then Earth itself stands as the sole remaining witness. Long before our emergence, Earth was not silent. It resonated with sounds belonging entirely to other species, the rustling of wind through vegetation that no longer exists, the low calls of animals whose skeletal remains are the sole remnants of their physical presence, the continuous grinding and trickling of water as it carved its path through landscapes that would have been utterly alien to us. Somewhere within that intricate tapestry, there may have existed minds that functioned in ways we could comprehend. Minds that discerned patterns, that retained memories not merely for immediate survival, but for their intrinsic value, that envisioned future outcomes before they occurred. Minds that dreamed. It is tempting to associate dreaming with a distinctly human attribute, linked to our capacity for narrative construction and the visualization of concepts beyond our immediate sensory perception. However, animals also dream. We infer this from observing their brain activity during sleep, noting how dogs twitch their paws as if running, or how birds move their eyes beneath closed eyelids. Dreaming appears to be a neurological function executed by brains possessing sufficient complexity to process memories and explore hypothetical scenarios. It does not necessitate a language akin to ours, nor the presence of cities or literature. It simply requires a nervous system capable of interweaving experiences into something more profound than a mere playback. If this premise holds true, then numerous species predating our own could have experienced dreams. We would anticipate that most of these dreams would be shaped by their respective biological imperatives, dreams pertaining to hunting, predator evasion, or seeking shelter. However, a select few might have advanced the practice of dreaming, much like we have. They might have conceptualized events that never transpired. They could have visualized tools, novel methods of food acquisition, or enhanced means of self-protection. Such imaginative leaps, replicated across generations, possess the potential to fundamentally alter a species' mode of existence. Once a mind is capable of envisioning something different from its current reality, the seed of innovation is planted. The transition from utilizing a naturally occurring object as a tool to fashioning an object for a specific purpose represents a relatively small evolutionary step, yet its consequences are monumental. It signifies a diminished dependence on the immediate environment. The capacity to actively modify it arises. Construction becomes possible, and preparation for future contingencies becomes feasible. Furthermore, when this skill is shared among individuals, it can be transmitted, refined, and evolve into traditions that extend beyond a single lifespan. We observe the nascent stages of this phenomenon in extant species. Chimpanzees teach each other how to strip leaves from branches to fashion tools for extracting termites. Certain bird species learn to manipulate wire fragments to access food, and this acquired knowledge disseminates throughout the group. Dolphins develop unique hunting strategies in specific regions, passing these techniques down to their offspring. These are the foundational elements of culture, and they exist independently of humanity. They demonstrate that intelligence is not an absolute quality, but exists along a spectrum, and that we are part of a much larger kinship of problem solvers. Applying this understanding to the deep past, it becomes readily conceivable that some lineage of life might have attained a level of cooperation, foresight, and inventiveness far exceeding that observed in other species today. The distinction between sophisticated tool utilization and full-fledged civilization lies in degree and temporal duration. It requires a stable environmental context, extended enough for ideas to accumulate, techniques to improve, and knowledge to propagate widely enough to become integral to the very fabric of existence. Given millions of years, even a modest beginning could blossom into something extraordinary. But what would be necessary for such a transformative leap to occur? Large brains are advantageous, but they are not the sole determinant. Social structures play a significant role. Intelligence flourishes when there is a functional imperative to comprehend and anticipate the actions of others. Effective communication is also paramount. The capacity to swiftly exchange thoughts ensures that breakthroughs aren't lost with the passing of an individual. Curiosity holds significance. The inherent desire to explore beyond immediate survival necessities can pave the way for novel opportunities. In our own circumstances, all these elements converged. It's plausible they may have aligned previously within a different evolutionary branch, beneath alien skies and amidst unfamiliar beings. We often conceptualize sapience assuming the same form it manifests in us: an upright stance, dexterous hands, capable of intricate manipulation, forward facing eyes, and a vocal apparatus adept at producing complex sounds. However, these are merely the instruments provided by our specific biological design. Another species might have constructed its intelligence upon disparate foundations. It could have thrived in an aquatic realm, employing fins or tendrils to interact with its surroundings. It might have taken to the skies, leveraging its aerial vantage point for navigation and strategic planning. Perhaps it was diminutive, relying on collective strength and numbers rather than physical stature. Sapience is malleable. It discovers avenues for self-expression through whatever form it assumes. Should such a species have existed, its aspirations could have been as diverse as our own. They might have envisioned improved methods for acquiring sustenance or safer strategies for nurturing their young. Perhaps they recounted tales to one another, even if those narratives adopted a form unrecognizable to us as language. It's conceivable they adorned their dwellings or generated auditory or visual arrangements purely for their intrinsic pleasure. Art stands as one of intelligence's most enigmatic indicators, given its lack of direct necessity for survival. It suggests a consciousness that values aesthetic appeal, symbolic representation, or the very act of creation. This is the sort of intellect that might leave behind evidence worth discovering. Naturally, the vast majority of dreams leave no tangible imprint. Even within our own recorded history, much of our contemplation and imagination dissipates the moment we awaken. Civilizations preserve merely a sliver of their creations, and this fragment is susceptible to the ravages of time. The more ancient the testament, the greater its likelihood of being obliterated. Therefore, if the earliest intelligent beings also engaged in construction, they would have needed to build in a manner capable of withstanding the gradual erosion of epochs. Stone possesses greater longevity than wood. Fired clay endures longer than woven fibers. Metal can persist, yet it too can degrade entirely given sufficient duration. Absent preservation, the majority of any civilization's output will ultimately vanish. This is where the challenge of substantiating such a proposition becomes apparent. Even within our contemporary metropolises, equipped with our advanced technology, the process of deterioration commences swiftly. Without upkeep, roadways fissure and edifices crumble. Within a few centuries, the configurations of thoroughfares might remain discernible from above. Yet, over a few millennia, the earth might have utterly reclaimed them. Over 1 million years, they could be reduced to mere subtle variations in soil composition. Within tens of millions, they might be unrecognizable. Consequently, when scholars contemplate the possibility of an antecedent civilization, they frequently seek indirect indicators, alterations in geological chemistry, abrupt climatic shifts, potentially attributable to industrial endeavors, or deposits of materials not found naturally. These phenomena are less vulnerable to erosion than a structure or an implement. They represent the geological parallel to imprints on a very ancient pathway. However, even these are infrequent, and nature independently produces peculiar results. Differentiating the artificial from the natural can be arduous, especially when one is surveying a period spanning tens of millions of years. Nevertheless, the contemplation persists. Somewhere, at some juncture in Earth's history, it remains within the realm of possibility that the initial minds capable of conceptualizing as we do embarked upon the initial steps toward something grander. Perhaps they subsisted in small aggregations initially, dispersed across a terrain teeming with predators and unpredictable weather patterns. They might have learned to seek refuge in caverns, or to erect shelters or platforms that outlasted a single season. It's conceivable they began to harness fire or some other form of controlled energy. With each progression, their world would have transformed, and with every alteration, the chasm between their existence and that of other organisms around them would have widened. Should they have attained the capacity to modify their environment on a substantial scale, they might have expanded into novel territories, adapting to diverse climates and resources. Commerce could have emerged, even if it amounted to no more than the exchange of scarce commodities or foodstuffs between groups. Over time, their accumulated knowledge could have blossomed into something akin to our early urban centers, hubs where concepts, goods, and proficiencies coalesced. The specifics are unknowable, yet the trajectory is familiar. It is the path we traversed, and one that evolution might have laid down on multiple occasions. Whether they left anything discernible to us today is a separate question. The chronicle of life on this planet is replete with lacunae, even for species whose existence we acknowledge. Most of the narrative is absent, with only scattered fragments remaining to hint at what once was. This is precisely why this conjecture is so challenging to affirm or refute. The absence of evidence is not indicative of absence itself. It is merely a consequence of the planet's intrinsic mechanisms. Time perpetually advances, ceaselessly reshaping, perpetually obscuring the vestiges of preceding eras. And so, we can only conjecture about the primordial minds that conceived, picturing them within landscapes long vanished, discerning their voices in sounds we can no longer decipher. They might have borne no resemblance to us, or they might have shared more than we anticipate. The mere possibility is sufficient to impress upon us that our standing in history is not inherently unique. Intelligence may be infrequent, but it may not be singular. The earth may have harbored it previously and could do so again. From this vantage point, the inquiry shifts from mere feasibility to an exploration of what we truly signify when we employ the term civilization. When we articulate the word civilization, It's effortless to envision towering stone edifices, expansive thoroughfares, and intricate artistry etched into masonry. We associate it with written laws and governing bodies, with grand congregations of individuals constructing something transcending the capacity of any solitary entity. However, these are merely the readily recognizable paradigms drawn from our own historical record. Distill the term to its core. It is not contingent upon a particular architectural style or a specific form of governance. It pertains to a mode of existence wherein knowledge, culture, and technological advancements accrue across generations, and wherein this accumulation fundamentally alters the societal fabric. By this standard, civilization is not intrinsically tethered to external appearances. A community might reside in structures constructed entirely from organic materials, leaving no monumental ruins, and yet still constitute a civilization if they possess structured systems, shared knowledge, and methodologies for adapting their environment to their requirements. We tend to picture enduring stone monuments because they persist the longest, but immutability is not the ultimate determinant. Complexity is. It is also pertinent to acknowledge that civilizations can be of modest scale. We often conceptualize in terms of empires, nations, and sprawling metropolises, as these are the most readily identifiable within our own history. Yet human civilization did not commence at this level. It originated in dispersed enclaves linked by commerce and common practices, devoid of any overarching authority to unify them. What integrated them into the overarching narrative was the manner in which they exchanged ideas, transmitted techniques, and forged a collective memory that outlived any individual lifespan. Therefore, when inquiring whether a civilization might have existed on Earth prior to humanity, we must maintain this flexibility of perspective. It might not have resembled Rome or Mesopotamia. It might not have been predicated on agriculture. It might have relied on entirely different resources tailored to the species that established it. Even the notion of a city might have been distinct, perhaps not a dense congregation of permanent habitations, but a network of seasonal gathering places, interconnected by well-trodden routes, known to those who traverse them. One of the most significant impediments in defining civilization lies in our propensity to measure it against our own benchmarks. We regard written language as a paramount milestone, yet script is but one method of storing and disseminating information. Oral traditions can exhibit remarkable complexity and accuracy across extended temporal spans. We place value on monumental construction, but a society could achieve equally sophisticated feats through forms that vanish rapidly, such as woven constructions, carved wood, or even intentional arrangements of flora. We admire large-scale engineering projects, yet small, precise interventions within an ecosystem can be equally revealing. If a non-human civilization existed millions of years ago, it is conceivable that their way of life would not neatly fit our established classifications. They might not have engaged in systematic cultivation or managed livestock in pastures. They might not have left behind ceramic artifacts or metallic implements. They could have operated entirely with organic materials, employing techniques that left no discernible trace once those materials decomposed. In such a scenario, evidence of their existence would be more likely to manifest as subtle patterns within the landscape, altered watercourses, unusual soil compositions, or the sudden appearance of specific plant species far beyond their indigenous ranges. This is precisely why the definition of civilization holds such profound importance. If we restrict it to what we already recognize from human history, we risk overlooking indicators of alternative possibilities. Conversely, if we broaden it to encompass any sustained, organized mode of existence that shapes the environment and preserves knowledge, we open ourselves to a wider spectrum of evidence. This does not imply that every animal society should be designated a civilization. Ants and bees exhibit intricate social structures, but they operate almost exclusively on instinct, lacking the kind of cultural evolution observed in humans. The crucial distinction lies in innovation that builds upon itself, fostering changes over time that are not solely genetic but learned and shared. Consider the methods by which archaeologists ascertain whether a past human group belonged to a civilization. They seek indicators of long distance trade, specialized vocations, symbolic expression, and the capacity to sustain communities exceeding the immediate familial unit. None of these necessitate stone structures. None require metal. They simply demand organization, cooperation, and shared cultural heritage. These are the markers that, in theory, could appear in the fossil record of a non-human species, although their discovery would be exceptionally challenging without direct artifacts. Furthermore, there is the question of the duration a civilization must endure before it is deemed significant. Certain human civilizations have persisted for millennia, while others have emerged and receded within a few centuries. In geological terms, even 1,000 years represents a fleeting moment. Yet, during that interval, the impact can be immense. Forests felled, rivers rerouted, species relocated from one continent to another. These transformations can occasionally be detected in sedimentary layers, offering insights into human activity long after the structures have vanished. If a pre-human civilization persisted long enough to significantly alter ecosystems, we might anticipate observing analogous traces, even if we did not initially recognize them as such. Naturally, one of the inherent risks of such contemplation is that natural phenomena can themselves generate patterns that appear artificial. A perfectly symmetrical hill could be the remnant of an ancient volcanic caldera rather than a constructed mound. Straight linear features in rock formations can arise from natural fissuring. Even large-scale alterations in vegetation could be attributable to climatic shifts rather than deliberate cultivation. This implies that to identify a genuine civilization, multiple lines of corroborating evidence would be requisite. Changes in the terrain, unusual material depositions, and potentially even fossilized remains of the species itself exhibiting behavioral anomalies beyond the ordinary. And this leads to another crucial consideration. What would the members of this hypothetical civilization have been like physically? We frequently presume that advanced cognition necessitates a physical form capable of fine manipulation, such as hands or tentacles, or this presumption stems from the fact that the majority of our technological innovations are designed with such instruments in mind. However, if a civilization evolved with different aptitudes, it might have developed technologies bearing no resemblance to our own, perhaps focusing more on the transformation of vast landscapes than on the meticulous crafting of small objects. They could have been aquatic beings, interacting with their environment in ways that would be exceedingly difficult to reconstruct from the fossil record. They might have been volant, constructing ephemeral abodes in trees or on cliffs. Their intelligence might have found expression in structures fashioned entirely from living organisms that underwent continuous transformation. The inherent difficulty in defining civilization is a primary reason why the inquiry into a pre-human epoch is so compelling. It compels us to contemplate intelligence and culture devoid of the familiar reference points from our own history. It invites us to conceptualize forms of organization and creation that we might otherwise overlook if we were solely searching for stone cities and bronze implements. It serves as a reminder that our trajectory represents but one of many potential paths, and that the principles we deem universal may simply be localized customs of our species. Even at this present moment, as we observe the life that surrounds us, we can discern glimmers of alternative evolutionary trajectories. Elephants modify their environment by felling trees and excavating water holes, changes that persist long after the individuals themselves are gone. Certain avian species construct elaborate edifices to attract mates, structures that can be repurposed and augmented over time. Whales communicate across immense distances, their vocalizations conveying information that may fluctuate with the seasons and the years. None of these quite surmount the threshold into civilization as we currently define it, yet they demonstrate the proximity with which other species can approach its boundaries. In a different ecological context, subjected to distinct pressures and possessing more time, those boundaries could indeed be breached. Once we accept that civilization may not always conform to our familiar model, the subsequent question becomes how we would even commence searching for it within the deep past. Such an investigation would not begin with overt ruins. It would commence with subtle anomalies detected within the geological and fossil records. It would necessitate collaboration among scientists from diverse disciplines, pooling their observations, reevaluating data with fresh perspectives, and posing the question of whether an unusual finding might be the product of intentional action rather than random occurrence. This is a protracted, meticulous endeavor, one that could equally confirm a naturalistic explanation as it could unveil something extraordinary. The challenge is immense, but so too is the temporal scale we are considering. The Earth has had billions of years to foster experiments in life. We are aware of at least one such experiment that yielded a civilization, our own. It is not unreasonable to ponder whether another might have existed, whether it left any discernible traces for us to discover hinges upon how we conceptualize those traces and our willingness to perceive them in forms that defy our expectations. This brings us to the matter of what signs we could realistically detect if such an event had transpired. When individuals envision uncovering the distant past, they often picture paleontologists meticulously brushing away the final vestiges of soil from a perfectly preserved skeleton, revealing a creature as if it had merely dozed off moments before. The reality is considerably less dramatic and far more ephemeral. The vast majority of what transpired is irrevocably lost. What endures is a scattering of clues, incomplete and altered, frequently compressed into forms that bear little resemblance to their original state. The scientists who interpret these remnants function less like treasure hunters and more like linguists. They are deciphering a script that the Earth has been composing for hundreds of millions of years, a language shaped by immense pressure intense heat, and the relentless passage of time. A fossil is not a static entity. It represents a metamorphosis, a form of substitution. The original bone, shell, or leaf is progressively replaced, molecule by molecule, with minerals that infiltrate over eons, solidifying into stone. Occasionally, only an impression remains, a cast of the external contour, a spectral outline of a footprint, a ripple in mud that hardened before it could be disturbed. And just as frequently, those delicate imprints never materialize at all. They are washed away, fractured or entombed so deeply that they will never resurface. This accounts for the fragmented nature of the fossil record. Entire species can emerge and disappear without leaving a single preserved example for us to find. The conditions conducive to fossilization are rare and tend to manifest in specific environments: river deltas, lake beds, volcanic ash deposits, and seafloors where sediment accumulates rapidly. In arid highlands or dynamic coastlines, remains are far more likely to be destroyed before they can be preserved. Consequently, our understanding of the past is constructed from disparate fragments, biased toward those locales that offer protection. For an individual seeking evidence of an ancient civilization, this bias presents a formidable obstacle. Even within the relatively brief span of human history, our impact is unevenly distributed. Urban centers situated in deserts or floodplains can leave behind durable remnants, whereas coastal settlements might be effaced by rising sea levels or buried beneath accumulating sediment. Now, project this over millions of years and contemplate the sheer volume that could vanish entirely. If an advanced society had existed in a region that subsequently transformed into ocean floor, its traces might now be submerged beneath miles of water and sediment beyond the reach of most exploratory efforts. If it flourished in a forested territory that was later denuded by glaciers, it could be so thoroughly obliterated that even the landforms are erased. The individuals who meticulously sift through Earth's strata for evidence are keenly aware of this. They operate under the understanding that every discovery represents but a single point within a vast, largely imperceptible web of past life. They also recognize that some of the most significant findings do not originate from complete specimens, but from minuscule fragments. A single tooth can reveal dietary habits, age, and evolutionary lineage. A thin stratum of pollen trapped in sediment can chronicle ancient climates and vegetation. Chemical signatures within rock can allude to events such as volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or even abrupt, unexplained alterations in atmospheric composition. Those unexplained shifts are precisely the sort of phenomena that might suggest something anomalous, perhaps even the influence of a civilization. Our own industrial activities have already measurably altered the chemical composition of the atmosphere, leaving a layer of carbon isotopes that will remain detectable for vast stretches of the future. Plastics, metals, and synthetic compounds are pervading sediments across the globe. Even if all our constructed edifices were to vanish tomorrow, those traces would persist in the geological record for millions of years. The challenge, naturally, is that nature itself can produce peculiar patterns in chemistry and sediment. Massive volcanic events can inundate the atmosphere with carbon and sulfur. Extensive die-offs can result in layers rich in specific elements. Shifts in oceanic currents can redistribute sediments in unconventional ways. The fossil whisperers, as one might aptly call them, must weigh every plausible explanation before entertaining the most extraordinary hypotheses. In scientific inquiry, extraordinary assertions necessitate extraordinary corroboration. Nonetheless, there are instances where the evidence resists the most straightforward interpretations. Within certain geological strata, scientists have identified abrupt changes in mineral composition that suggest the rapid introduction of unusual substances, ones that do not appear to align with the gradual processes of erosion and deposition. The majority of these ultimately yield naturalistic explanations. Yet each time, the question lingers, what if, what if long before our time, another agency was at work, shaping the environment in ways we have yet to comprehend? The discovery of such evidence would not necessarily be as conspicuous as unearthing a sculpted statue or a worked piece of metal. It might manifest as more subtle patterns in the distribution of minerals, hinting at large-scale extraction, deposits of rare compounds, suggesting deliberate manufacturing, or a thin layer of material whose origin cannot be accounted for by known natural processes. Interpreting such patterns would demand not only expertise in geology, but also in chemistry, archaeology, and an openness to posing questions that may sound improbable. There is an inherent patience required for this type of investigation. Unraveling the past is not a simple matter of excavating a single artifact and declaring a mystery solved. It involves meticulously piecing together a wealth of evidence until a coherent narrative begins to emerge. In the context of a hypothetical pre-human society, this picture may never be fully realized, remaining instead as persistent echoes, inviting conjecture without offering definitive proof. This inherent ambiguity is part of its allure. We inhabit an era where the past often appears neatly catalogued and precisely measured. However, our understanding is, in reality, quite limited. The fossil record does not present a complete historical account. Rather, it consists of surviving fragments scattered globally, expressed in a language we are still learning to decipher. What it does reveal is that life has manifested in forms far stranger and more varied than we might have anticipated. Entire lineages within the evolutionary tree have flourished and faded with minimal, enduring evidence, and the world we perceive is merely the most recent iteration of a planet that has undergone countless transformations. Considering this, the notion of another civilization so thoroughly lost that its existence is discernible only through subtle geological traces does not seem entirely far-fetched. If such a civilization existed in an epoch or locale where fossilization was infrequent, if its members utilized materials prone to rapid degradation, or if their population was small enough to preclude significant global alterations, their remnants could be as elusive as the fading memory of a distant season. Scientists who delve into deep time are acutely aware of these possibilities, and it profoundly influences their interpretation of the ground beneath them. Every stratum of rock, every core sample retrieved from the ocean floor, every striation on a cliff face represents a segment of Earth's chronicle. Yet, these pages are worn, torn, and frequently absent altogether. Deciphering them demands not only technical proficiency, but also imagination, the capacity to perceive how a faint clue might connect to a broader pattern. And occasionally, just occasionally, it requires a willingness to entertain the most improbable hypothesis. This openness does not equate to hasty conclusions. Instead, it involves creating space for the unknown, for the possibility that Earth's ancient memory might still hold undiscovered marvels. From this perspective, the pertinent question becomes how the planet itself might safeguard or obliterate these potential surprises, and what forces could quietly efface nearly all vestiges of something that once existed. The Earth retains a memory, though not in the way we do. Our recollections are collections of moments, revisitable snapshots, sometimes vivid, sometimes indistinct. The planet's memory is more ponderous, inscribed in stone, ice, and sediment. It preserves records in layers, each formed from the detritus of what preceded it. However, it is also a forgetful memory, continuously reconfiguring itself, smoothing over ancient impressions, and interring some completely beneath the weight of new formations. It possesses no sentimentality, no inclination to preserve a scene for purely emotional reasons. Its transformations are intrinsic to its perpetual nature. If we could peel back Earth's crust, as one might pages in a book, we would uncover a narrative punctuated by vast missing chapters. Entire epochs have vanished, not due to their insignificance, but because the planet's formative processes are relentless. Mountains ascend through tectonic plate collisions, only to succumb to the erosive forces of wind and rain. Oceans expand as plates diverge, then contract as land masses converge. Volcanic eruptions deposit fresh rock layers, obscuring whatever lay beneath. Glacial ice sheets scythe across continents, stripping away surfaces with abrasive force. Even the subtle action of rivers transporting silt from one location to another can bury ancient landscapes and establish new ones. The surface we observe today is not the same one that existed 1 million years ago, or 10 million, or 100 million. Every region has undergone repeated reshaping. In some areas, the surface rocks may have formed only a few thousand years ago. In others, they could be hundreds of millions of years old, but so extensively altered that any original record is virtually obliterated. This ceaseless recycling of the crust means that the older something is, the less likely it is to survive in a recognizable form. For any civilization's traces to endure beyond a few tens of millions of years, extraordinary fortune would be necessary. They would need to be preserved in a geologically stable environment, one untouched by submergence, crushing forces, or abrasion. Even then, evidence could be distorted. Heat and pressure can alter rock structures, melting or warping embedded materials. Organic matter degrades rapidly unless sealed from air and moisture. And even then, time remains a formidable adversary. This explains why so much of Earth's primordial history is known only in broad strokes. The planet's initial billion years are represented by mere handfuls of rock fragments found in locations like Greenland and Western Australia. These offer the most rudimentary hints of contemporaneous events. The rest has been reabsorbed into the mantle and reemerged as new rock, devoid of its original imprints. The same principle applies to more recent periods, albeit on a reduced scale. It is not solely geology that erases the past. Climate and biology can be equally thorough. A jungle can engulf a settlement within decades, concealing it beneath layers of soil, vegetation, and trees. Insects and microbes decompose wood, leather, and fabric. Salt water corrodes metal. Even stone can be eroded by plants, rain, and frost. On a human timescale, ruins may appear enduring, but relative to the planet's lifespan, they are fleeting interruptions. If humanity were to vanish tomorrow, the most conspicuous markers of our presence, roads, buildings, bridges, would begin to deteriorate within a century. In 10,000 years, most would be gone. In a million years, only scattered remnants might persist, buried deep in sediment or transformed into mineral deposits. After 10 million years, our terrestrial alterations might be discernible only as subtle patterns, such as a straightened river channel or a localized deposit of unusual elements. The remainder would be effaced by ceaseless geological processes. This underscores the immense challenge of investigating deep history. We are not searching for intact artifacts, but for fragments that have miraculously endured despite overwhelming forces working against them. And the further back we look, the more we must accept that the record will be inherently incomplete, perhaps hopelessly so. Entire continents' worth of history may remain unknowable, not because it is concealed, but because it has effectively ceased to exist. Even the ocean floor, seemingly a stable repository of the past, is in constant flux. Geologically speaking, the crust beneath the deep oceans is young, typically no more than about 200 million years old in most areas, due to its continuous recycling into the mantle at subduction zones. Consequently, anything older than that, however well preserved at the time, has been destroyed. Land masses can endure longer, but are far from impervious. Uplift and erosion reshape them, and continental drift alters coastlines and climates in ways that obliterate prior features. This continuous turnover contributes to the numerous gaps in the fossil record. It is not indicative of a lack of life during those periods, but rather a failure of preservation conditions. If one conceives of Earth as a library, it is one where entire shelves of books have been incinerated, rewritten, or incorporated into other volumes. What remains are disparate chapters, sometimes missing pages, sometimes with text so eroded that its original meaning is obscure. Nevertheless, this imperfect memory is the sole resource available to us. Scientists studying it constantly weigh preserved evidence against what is absent, endeavoring to reconstruct a narrative from incomplete data. The recovery of a well-preserved fossil is attributable to a rare confluence of circumstances: rapid burial, stable environmental conditions, and protection from scavengers and decay. The same would apply to any artifact from a lost civilization. It would necessitate swift burial in a location shielded from destruction for millennia. Even then, recognition would pose a significant obstacle. A shaped stone might be misidentified as a natural formation. An unusual mineral deposit could be dismissed as a product of peculiar but natural geological processes. In the absence of a clear contextual framework, a cluster of associated discoveries, all pointing in the same direction, it would be easy to overlook or misinterpret such evidence. Therefore, contemplating the planet's memory fundamentally alters our perspective on the possibility of a lost civilization. It is insufficient to merely envision what they might have constructed. We must also consider how those creations would interact with the enduring forces of erosion, subduction, and decay over unimaginable timescales. We must envision what might survive and in what form, acknowledging that the vast majority would not endure at all. What the planet does preserve, it does so in measurable ways. Chemical signatures embedded in rocks, minuscule fossils encased in amber, imprints of leaves or shells pressed into ancient mud. These are the fragments that escape the relentless rewriting of the surface. They are invaluable, not for providing a complete picture, but for offering any glimpse whatsoever. The remainder is lost as if it never existed. This, more than anything, explains our uncertainty about Earth's prior inhabitants. If the planet can obliterate nearly all evidence of our existence within a few million years, it is equally capable of having done the same to others. Its memory is vast but selective, guarding its secrets diligently. If other beings existed before us, beings who dreamed, built, and then vanished, their presence would now be little more than the faintest of signatures, if even that. The question then becomes whether we have already overlooked some of these signatures, or if they remain buried, awaiting the right circumstances for their revelation. This contemplation naturally leads to another line of inquiry. If the planet has harbored intelligence before, what forms of life might have been capable of it? When we envision the age of reptiles, our minds typically conjure images of dinosaurs as depicted in museum exhibits or films, colossal predators with formidable teeth, majestic long-necked herbivores traversing wetlands, and herds of armored plant eaters brandishing their tails like living fortifications. This perspective is dominated by sheer size and spectacle, a world seemingly governed by brute strength. However, the reign of reptiles spanned over 160 million years, a period ample enough for far more than just magnitude to evolve. It provided opportunities for creatures that were small, agile, and intelligent, for predators that relied on precision as much as power, for opportunistic species capable of adapting to shifting environments in ways that suggest more than mere instinct. If we are to entertain the possibility of a civilization predating our own, the Mesozoic era, when dinosaurs reached their zenith, is a prime candidate for curiosity, not because we imagine city-building tyrannosaurs, but because evolution had an immense expanse of time to explore countless forms. The biodiversity during that era was extraordinary. There were flying reptiles capable of crossing entire oceans, aquatic reptiles dominating the seas, and terrestrial creatures ranging in size from that of a chicken to that of several buses. Among them were small gracile species with brains proportionally larger than those of their colossal kin. While brain size alone does not definitively determine intelligence, it offers valuable clues. Among modern animals, a general correlation exists. Species with higher brain-to-body mass ratios often exhibit more sophisticated behaviors, enhanced problem-solving abilities, and greater adaptability. Some of the smaller theropod dinosaurs, particularly those closely related to birds, possessed relatively large brains for their physical dimensions. They displayed acute vision, excellent coordination, and in some instances, evidence suggests they may have engaged in cooperative hunting or demonstrated parental care. These are precisely the traits that, given sufficient evolutionary time, could form the foundation for more complex social structures. Birds, after all, are extant dinosaurs, and some, like crows and parrots, exhibit remarkable cognitive capabilities. They utilize tools, recognize themselves in mirrors, and transmit learned behaviors across generations. If modern avian species can achieve such feats, it is not inconceivable that their ancestors might have possessed similar aptitudes, perhaps even surpassing them in lineages that are now extinct. The challenge lies in the fact that intelligence, in the sense we are considering it, leaves scant direct evidence in the fossil record. A fossil can reveal the cranial shape, allowing inferences about brain size and structure, but it cannot illuminate an animal's thought processes, communication methods, or planning capabilities. We must rely on indirect indicators, such as evidence of social behavior in trackways, signs of communal nesting sites, or distribution patterns that suggest migratory routes or intricate hunting strategies. While such hints exist for certain dinosaur species, they are far from conclusive. Furthermore, even if a highly intelligent dinosaur lineage had existed, the leap from intelligence to civilization represents an enormous conceptual hurdle. It would have necessitated not only cleverness, but also the capacity to manipulate the environment in enduring ways. This brings us to the question of anatomy. As far as we know, dinosaurs lacked manipulative appendages akin to human hands. Some possessed grasping claws, and their avian descendants exhibit dexterous beaks and feet. However, crafting tools in the manner of humans might have presented significant challenges. This is not to say it was impossible. They might have developed technologies suited to their physical forms, manipulating materials with their feet and mouths, utilizing natural landscape features as tools, or even collaborating to construct structures. If such a civilization had existed, what might it have resembled? It is tempting to envision settlements nestled in sheltered valleys or along riverbanks, perhaps constructed from plant matter, mud, or stone. They might have erected elevated platforms to mitigate flood risks, or established communal nesting grounds that were maintained and expanded over successive generations. Their artistic expressions, if they existed, could have taken forms we would not immediately recognize. Arrangements of feathers, shells, or colored minerals, patterns etched into the ground, or carvings on soft surfaces. The perennial obstacle, as always, is preservation. Organic materials like wood and plant fibers decompose rapidly, and even stone constructions can be effaced over millions of years. In the vast time frame since the last non-avian dinosaurs perished, continents have shifted, mountains have risen and eroded, and oceans have opened and closed. Any structures they erected would have had to withstand all these geological upheavals, and the likelihood of survival is slim. We might never discover evidence of such structures unless they left behind more durable markers, such as alterations in the distribution of specific minerals or indications of large-scale environmental modification. Nevertheless, the dominion of reptiles was sufficiently extensive to permit numerous evolutionary experiments. Our own lineage has produced tool-making intelligence only once, and this occurred within a fraction of the time dinosaurs were prevalent. It is not unreasonable to posit that somewhere within that vast temporal expanse, a lineage could have developed not only intelligence, but also culture. Whether this actually transpired is another question, but the possibility cannot be entirely discounted. It is also worth noting our tendency to perceive dinosaurs as primitive in comparison to mammals, a bias stemming from the fact that mammals currently dominate the planet. However, during the Mesozoic era, mammals were small, inconspicuous creatures living in the shadows. Dinosaurs occupied virtually every terrestrial ecological niche. If intelligence were to emerge during that period, it would logically arise from the dominant group. And if it did, its legacy might endure not in ruins, but in the behaviors of their descendants. The birds that continue to astonish us with their problem solving skills and adaptability demonstrate that even without a civilization, the age of reptiles illustrates how intelligence can manifest in unexpected ways and in forms vastly different from our own. It serves as a reminder that the capacity for complex thought is not tied to any single body plan or ecological role, but depends on opportunity, the felicitous combination of traits, and the time required for those traits to mature into something more profound. The concept of an intelligent culture building dinosaur lineage compels us to expand our imaginative horizons beyond the familiar. It challenges us to contemplate the kinds of civilizations that might develop under conditions entirely alien to us, with bodies and senses unlike our own, and in environments that no longer exist. This line of thought naturally segues into another possibility, one that transcends terrestrial realms and delves into the vast, largely hidden world beneath the ocean's surface. If the land is a restless and forgetful stage, perpetually shifting and erasing itself, the oceans present an even profounder enigma. They envelop most of the planet, concealing its loftiest mountains and deepest chasms, and harbor ecosystems that remain largely uncharted territory for us. Despite our extensive mapping of continents and cataloging of surface life, the sea remains a realm of unanswered questions. We have personally explored only a minuscule fraction of its depths, and much of its marine life never ventures close enough to the surface for us to observe. If a civilization had ever existed beneath the waves, its narrative might still be concealed in regions we have barely begun to investigate. This idea feels almost inevitable once one considers the immense timescales involved. Life originated in the oceans long before it ventured onto land. Complex multicellular organisms flourished there for hundreds of millions of years before the emergence of the first forests. Even after terrestrial ecosystems developed and thrived, the seas continued to nurture their own unique evolutionary experiments, some of which yielded animals of remarkable intelligence. Today, dolphins, whales, and certain octopus species exhibit cognitive abilities comparable to many land mammals. They solve problems, communicate with intricate methods, utilize tools, and in some instances, transmit learned behaviors across generations. If intelligence could evolve to such a degree in multiple marine lineages within the comparatively brief period since human evolution, it warrants consideration of what might have occurred had one of those lineages been granted tens of millions of additional years. The oceans have remained stable in certain aspects for immense durations. There have been no glaciers scouring them clean, no tectonic uplift exposing their floors to erosion. While currents and chemistry fluctuate, there has always been refuge for life within them. For an intelligent aquatic species, this could translate into an uninterrupted epoch for developing technologies and cultures tailored to their environment. The challenge for us, in conceptualizing such a civilization, lies in the fact that our understanding of technology is rooted in fire, metal, and stone, elements that are difficult or impossible to utilize underwater. However, technology need not resemble our own. A marine civilization might employ the resources available to them: shells, coral, volcanic rock, plant fibers, or even carefully cultivated colonies of living organisms. They might sculpt the seafloor, constructing dwellings within caves or trenches, cultivating seaweed and algae gardens for sustenance, and raising shellfish in protected areas. Their art could manifest as patterns formed from colored shells arranged in specific configurations, visible only from certain vantage points, or as intricate coral structures painstakingly grown over decades. Their communication might be based on sound, light, or even chemical signals, traveling through water far more efficiently than through air. Whales can convey messages across vast distances using low frequency sounds that propagate across entire ocean basins. Bioluminescent organisms already employ flashes of light for mutual signaling. Intelligent marine species could conceivably develop languages based on such systems, exchanging complex information without ever requiring a written script as we understand it. The remnants of such a society would likely be ephemeral. Organic matter decomposes rapidly in the ocean, particularly in warm, oxygen rich currents. While coral and shell formations can endure for centuries, over millions of years they either dissolve or become buried in silt. Even the ocean floor itself is a relatively young feature compared to terrestrial land masses. As new oceanic crust forms at mid-ocean ridges, it gradually moves outward and is ultimately drawn back into the mantle through subduction, carrying any structures built upon it into extreme heat and pressure that obliterates all evidence. The oldest existing ocean floor today is approximately 200 million years old, a mere blink in geological time. This implies that any civilization originating in the oceans and predating that era would have had its very home territory completely dismantled and recycled into new crust. Nevertheless, this does not guarantee that all traces would vanish. Some evidence might persist in coastal zones that were once submerged in shallow seas only to be uplifted above sea level by tectonic shifts. We frequently discover marine fossils embedded within desert cliffs and mountain ranges, serving as testament to ancient oceans that no longer exist. Had a marine civilization erected structures in such shallow aquatic regions, fragments of these might still lie preserved, buried beneath layers of sediment, awaiting discovery. Chemical signatures could provide another avenue of inquiry. Large-scale modifications to the marine environment, whether through cultivation, construction, or energy utilization, could leave telltale signs within the sediment's chemical composition. We already observe how human activities leave such imprints. Alterations in nitrogen levels from agricultural runoff, deposits of heavy metals from mining and industrial processes, and microplastic accumulation in sediments globally. Over extended periods, most of these will be interred, but some might be conserved in deeper strata, informing future geologists that something once profoundly altered the oceans in a manner inexplicable by natural forces alone. There is also the possibility of finding fossilized remnants of the species itself. Bones, exoskeletons, or other robust biological components can survive if they are buried swiftly in oxygen-depleted environments, such as deep-sea sediments or anoxic basins, where decomposition is significantly retarded. If an intelligent marine species possessed such resilient body parts, a few might have undergone fossilization. The challenge lies in identifying them for what they are. Lacking a contemporary analog, their skeletal structure might not be recognized as belonging to an intelligent, tool-using organism. They might simply be classified as an unusual extinct animal, their sophisticated capabilities remaining entirely unsuspected. Contemplating an oceanic dominion also compels us to reassess our assumptions about the prerequisites of civilization. We habitually associate the concept with terrestrial pursuits, agriculture, permanent settlements, and monumental structures. However, in the ocean, resources are three-dimensional, distributed throughout a volume rather than confined to a surface. Mobility could be paramount, eclipsing permanence, and cyclical or migratory patterns might supersede the fixed territorial boundaries we associate with human societies. An aquatic culture might entirely eschew cities, instead congregating in temporary hubs at specific times of the year, subsequently dispersing into smaller cadres. Their history could be transmitted solely through oral traditions, song, or genetically inherited behavioral patterns, leaving virtually no physical trace for us to unearth. It is also conceivable that an oceanic civilization might have engaged with the land in some capacity, especially if it encompassed amphibious species or individuals capable of limited terrestrial sojourns. They might have exploited resources from coastlines, bluffs, or intertidal zones. Perhaps they even engineered shorelines to suit their requirements. Such interactions could leave more enduring evidence, such as meticulously arranged stones, altered watercourses, or colossal shell constructions, far exceeding anything created by non sentient organisms. Over millions of years, these could become buried within coastal sediments, awaiting recognition of their significance. The oceans have perpetually been arenas of both profusion and peril. Sustenance can be abundant, but so too are predators. Storms, currents, and fluctuating temperatures possess the capacity to reshape entire regions. For an intelligent marine species, survival would necessitate not only an understanding of oceanic patterns, but also the ability to anticipate and adapt to its inherent variability. This accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations, could form the bedrock of their culture. And mirroring the complex social dynamics observed in contemporary whales and dolphins, the communal bonds within such a species could be profound and enduring, with individuals collaborating, educating, and nurturing one another in ways that far transcend mere instinct. Were such a civilization to have existed, its demise might be even more challenging to detect than that of a terrestrial one. The very environment that sustained it would simultaneously act to obscure its passing. Tempestuous weather would dismantle their creations. Currents would disperse them. Geological processes would inexorably reclaim their habitats. All that might endure is a subtle chemical anomaly within a rock stratum once formed on the seabed, or a few scattered fossils unrecognized as anything more than the remnants of another extinct marine creature. Yet, the ocean is patient. It has harbored life since its inception and will likely continue to do so long after continents have assumed configurations unrecognizable to us. It possesses the inherent capacity to foster intelligence, as it has demonstrably done on multiple occasions within our recorded era. If sentience can repeatedly emerge within the comparatively brief span of our existence, it is plausible that it has arisen previously in forms we can only conjecture. From this vantage point, the path of speculation leads back to the terrestrial realm, toward other potential candidates for an early civilization, creatures that might not have exerted the same visible dominion over the planet as dinosaurs, nor populated its depths as extensively as marine empires, but that could have achieved their own form of complexity before our advent. The organisms that most readily capture our imagination when considering prehistoric eras are often those that left behind colossal skeletal remains or striking silhouettes. Dinosaurs, mammoths, and saber-toothed cats are the prominent figures. However, the Earth's past was not solely shaped by titans. A significant portion of its narrative was penned by smaller, less conspicuous creatures, those that occupy the spaces between the spectacular and the mundane. And among these, it is conceivable that species attained levels of intelligence and cooperative behavior that never made it into our esteemed fossil collections. These are the beings we might term the forgotten architects. They may not have commanded vast ecosystems or occupied the apex predator niche of their epoch. Instead, they could have resided in tightly knit communities, possibly within protected environments, where resources were predictable and sufficiently secure to permit experimentation. Intelligence does not invariably flourish in the spotlight. At times, it develops unobtrusively in the periphery, in settings where the exigencies of survival allow for periods of learning, instruction, and innovation. Observing life in the present day, we can discern that the seeds of civilization like behaviors are present in more than just humanity. Beavers reshape waterways and landscapes to construct ponds for their dwellings. Certain avian species construct intricate nests, meticulously weaving them from diverse materials in ways that exhibit individuality and even regional artistic styles. Some primate groups establish complex social hierarchies and transmit techniques for tool utilization across generations. Ants and termites erect elaborate subterranean metropolises or towering mounds, complete with sophisticated ventilation systems and specialized chambers. While none of these examples fully encompass what we would define as civilization, they offer glimpses into how environmental pressures and social dynamics can cultivate the conditions for something more profound. Imagining a forgotten builder from the distant past, it might have possessed a confluence of these attributes: an inherent capacity to manipulate its surroundings, a talent for problem solving, and a cultural imperative to transfer knowledge from one generation to the next. Such a species might not have required dominion over every corner of the globe. It could have flourished within a circumscribed territory, subtly adapting its environment to meet its needs in ways that would leave scant evidence millennia later. The physical form of these hypothetical builders could have been remarkably varied. They might have been small mammals with agile paws, capable of precise material manipulation. They could have been large birds with powerful beaks and feet, adept at transporting and arranging objects. They might even have been reptiles or amphibians with dexterous appendages, thriving in moist or forested locales. The unifying characteristic would have been an ability to intentionally and repeatedly employ their physical forms to alter their surroundings. The structures they erected might bear no resemblance to our architectural conventions. They could have been fashioned entirely from organic materials, woven shelters from plant fibers, excavated chambers reinforced with clay, or elevated platforms constructed from interlocking branches. These would not have endured for long after abandonment, particularly in humid climes where decay and insect activity are swift. Over vast geological timescales, even the soil patterns they might have left behind could be erased by erosion, inundation, and the gradual churn of geological processes. The fundamental challenge in uncovering evidence of such a species mirrors that of any ancient civilization. The majority of what we might seek would have long since vanished. Our investigation would necessitate a focus on indirect indicators. If their construction methods influenced water flow, we might observe anomalous sedimentary patterns or strata enriched in specific minerals. If they practiced agriculture, the fossilized pollen record might reveal a sudden and localized proliferation of a particular species far beyond its natural distribution. If their subsistence involved specific hunting or gathering techniques, distinctive assemblages of animal remains might be present in ancient deposits. However, even these signs can be equivocal. Nature abounds with processes that can mimic the outcomes of intelligent activity. Rivers naturally alter their courses, transporting minerals to new areas. Wind and fauna can disseminate plant seeds far from their points of origin. Accumulations of prey, remains at kill sites, can resemble the carefully curated caches of a hunting society. Differentiating deliberate actions from random occurrences represents one of archaeology's most formidable challenges, a difficulty that escalates with temporal depth. Furthermore, we must address the matter of how we conceptualize intelligence. We largely gauge it through human centric metrics, prioritizing abilities that mirror our own. We regard language, symbolic art, and sophisticated tool use as paramount indicators. Yet alternative expressions of intelligence may exist that do not yield tangible artifacts. A species of forgotten builders might have developed elaborate oral traditions, internalized mental maps of landscapes, or convened for seasonal gatherings to exchange knowledge, forms of culture that would entirely dissipate once the species ceased to exist. Their most significant accomplishments could have been wholly ephemeral, surviving solely within the consciousness of their members and lost irrevocably with them. It is plausible that certain lineages we currently perceive as commonplace animals were once capable of far more than we currently comprehend. Evolution is not a linear progression toward escalating complexity. Rather, it is a dynamic branching process wherein traits emerge, recede, and occasionally resurface in altered forms. A species might develop advanced intelligence and subsequently relinquish it if it no longer confers a selective advantage. If such an event transpired in the past, the vestiges might be so faint that we would not even know where to commence our search. We must also consider the possibility that these forgotten builders coexisted with other intelligent species, perhaps even engaging in competition with them. The fossil record attests to numerous periods where multiple large fauna inhabited the same ecosystems concurrently, particularly among mammals. If one species proved more adaptable or better suited to environmental shifts and resource availability, it could have supplanted another before the latter had sufficient time to leave a substantial mark. In such a scenario, the builders might have been eradicated not only by geological forces, but also by the ascendance of their rivals. In our present era, we have witnessed the rapid disappearance of cultures when confronted with competition, environmental upheaval, or disease. Entire languages have been lost within a single generation. Knowledge accumulated over centuries can evaporate when the individuals who safeguard it are displaced or annihilated. Scaling this phenomenon over millions of years, it becomes evident how an entire civilization, especially one that was diminutive or geographically restricted, could vanish without leaving more than a whisper in the geological strata. If such builders existed, they might have been remarkably adept at adaptation in their own unique fashion, devising solutions tailored to their specific environments rather than pursuing the technological trajectory familiar to us. They might have domesticated fauna unknown to us, cultivated flora that is now extinct, or sculpted landscapes in ways that we no longer recognize. In their time, they could have been as successful and innovative as we are today, even if the form of their civilization bore no resemblance to our own. The contemplation of these forgotten builders fosters a sense of profound humility. It serves as a reminder that the history of life is vastly more extensive than the human narrative, and that intelligence and culture may have blossomed in numerous forms preceding our own. The world we inhabit is not the singular world that has ever been conceivable, and the modes of existence we take for granted represent merely one branch of a much grander arboreal structure. Speculating about them also compels us to reframe our methods of investigating the past. Instead of solely seeking monolithic stone structures or metallic implements, we might also investigate subtler patterns, alterations in soil chemistry, unusual concentrations of specific flora or fauna, or geological formations that deviate inexplicably from the prevailing natural processes. We might cultivate the ability to perceive the possibility of deliberate design in places where we would otherwise discern only chance. And if we concede that such a species could have existed on land without leaving overt ruins, it becomes more plausible to envisage that analogous narratives might have unfolded in other environments, on mountain slopes, within desert oases, in locales where the landscape itself served as their principal instrument. This naturally leads us toward considering not merely the materials they might have utilized, but the very science of detecting traces so faint that they are barely discernible from the ambient background noise of Earth's own evolutionary history. When one contemplates the tangible remnants of epochs past, it is easy to envision the conspicuous ones: skeletal remains displayed in museum exhibits, stone implements housed in glass cases, fragments of pottery bearing their original painted designs. Yet, the reality is that the vast majority of life's history is not preserved in such artifacts. It is inscribed in the minutest details, deeply embedded within the Earth's geological strata, where the very sediment functions as an archive. Every grain of sand, every particle of silt, every stratum of clay represents a page in a tome that required millions of years to compose. And akin to any book, some pages are faded, some are smudged, and some are entirely absent. Sediment is ubiquitous. It accumulates in rivers and lakes, on the ocean floor in deserts, and at the foothills of mountains. It is composed of the eroded fragments of older rocks, the organic remains of flora and fauna, and dust transported by wind or washed down by precipitation. Over time, layer upon layer accumulates, entombing whatever falls within it. Under propitious conditions, if the material is rapidly covered and shielded from disturbance, these strata can persist for millions of years, preserving the most subtle clues about the world that engendered them. To the discerning observer, these layers can narrate tales. A coarse, pebbly deposit might indicate that a swift flowing river once coursed through the area. Fine, homogeneous silt could suggest a tranquil lake or a languid section of the sea. Alternating bands of light and dark might reflect seasonal variations, akin to the annual growth rings of a tree. Even in the absence of a single fossil, sediment can reveal whether the climate was warm or cold, humid or arid, stable or turbulent. And at times, the sediment harbors more than just a general impression. It can contain microscopic remnants, minuscule shells from plankton, pollen grains from ancient forests, or spores from long extinct ferns. These particles are remarkably resilient and can indicate which plants and animals were present when the layer was deposited. A sudden surge in one type of pollen might imply that a particular plant experienced an unusual proliferation in that region. A sharp decline could signify its disappearance, perhaps due to climatic shifts, natural calamities, or the encroachment of a novel entity that disrupted the ecological equilibrium. For anyone seeking evidence of a vanished civilization, this is often where the trail leads, not to grand ruins or intact artifacts, but to subtle, layered environmental alterations that could hint at anthropomorphic influence. We are aware from our own historical record that agriculture, deforestation, mining, and pollution all leave quantifiable imprints in sediments. Large-scale cultivation modifies the composition of pollen in the soil. Metalworking can introduce residual traces of lead, copper, or mercury that endure long after the smelting furnaces have cooled. Even our contemporary plastic waste is settling into sediments across the globe, forming a future geological stratum that will be unequivocally recognizable to whoever or whatever scrutinizes it millions of years hence. The inherent challenge, of course, is that natural processes can engender many of the same indicators. Volcanic eruptions can disseminate heavy metals over vast distances. Droughts can decimate certain plant species, allowing others to expand their range. Fluctuations in oceanic currents can alter sediment chemistry across extensive areas. A dark, carbon-rich layer might suggest widespread combustion. However, determining whether this burning resulted from a lightning-ignited wildfire or deliberate land clearing by an intelligent species is not straightforward. This is why scientists who study sediments often approach them in a manner analogous to detectives examining a crime scene. A single piece of evidence is insufficient. One seeks patterns, a confluence of clues pointing toward a common origin. If a sediment layer exhibits an anomalous chemical signature, one inquires, is there a corresponding alteration in pollen? Are there indications of soil disturbance consistent with agricultural or construction activities? Do the fossilized remains of fauna exhibit a sudden shift in diet or habitat that would be logical if human or human-like beings were modifying the landscape? Even when patterns do emerge, certainty remains elusive. The further one delves into the past, the more indistinct the details become. A single sediment layer might have taken centuries to form, effectively blending events that occurred years apart. Over millions of years, pressure and chemical transformations can alter the material's composition, obscuring or distorting the original signals. And because sediments are in constant flux, being moved and redeposited, a singular discovery might have traveled far from its original deposition site, yet the potential for revelation persists. If an ancient civilization engaged in activities such as extensive agriculture, metallurgy, or energy generation, some trace might endure in sediments, particularly in geologically stable regions that remained undisturbed for extended durations. The critical factor would be identifying these stable locales and interpreting their strata with sufficient precision to differentiate the extraordinary from the commonplace. In our own time, we have already observed the dramatic extent to which human activity can reshape sediments. In areas proximal to industrial centers, strata laid down over merely the past 100 years are replete with chemical markers. These range from residues of leaded gasoline to radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing. Far removed from urban centers, in remote lakes and polar ice formations, sediments still bear the unmistakable fingerprints of human industry, transported by atmospheric currents and ocean drifts that reach even the most isolated locations. These are changes so pervasive that they will be discernible in the geological record for tens of millions of years, provided we can leave such a profound mark in such a brief interval. This prompts the question: what would the equivalent stratum from a past civilization resemble? If they were industrialized, the sediment might contain traces of their energy sources, whether that involved biomass combustion, metal smelting, or something entirely unfamiliar to us. If they modified landscapes for agricultural purposes, the pollen record might indicate abrupt and enduring shifts in plant composition. If their primary habitats were along coasts or rivers, the sediments in those regions would likely exhibit the densest concentration of clues. There's also a fascinating contemplation that a prior society might have utilized substances we wouldn't identify as manufactured. Our own geological layers now contain synthetic elements, such as plastics, that were absent in nature until our own creations. Eons from now, these might persist as distinct microscopic particulates, even if they no longer visually resemble their original forms. An extraterrestrial civilization could have devised its own unique materials, which might currently appear to us as aberrant but naturally occurring mineral inclusions. Without knowing what indicators to seek, we could easily overlook them. Deciphering sedimentary records for remnants of the past necessitates patience and diligence. Every geological core sample, every exposed rock face presents a conundrum with absent pieces. The challenge lies not merely in amassing as much evidence as possible, but in posing the pertinent questions regarding their significance. Are we observing the ramifications of climate, geology, biological processes, or something entirely unrelated? Are we witnessing a transformation in the natural world, or the enduring imprint of intelligent action? The deeper one delves into the strata, the more one comprehends the extent of their contents and their capacity for concealment. They serve as both witnesses and participants in the planet's chronicles, documenting events even as they are molded by them. Should a past civilization have left its indelible mark here, it would be akin to a phantom within the record, faint, incomplete, and readily mistaken for something else entirely. Its discovery would demand not only technical proficiency, but also the inclination to perceive intelligence where we are conditioned to see only natural phenomena. And should such a phantom ever be acknowledged for its true nature, it would compel us to reevaluate our entire understanding of our position in the planet's temporal narrative. We would no longer perceive ourselves as the inaugural agents of enduring terrestrial alteration, but rather as but one in a succession of architects, separated by such vast epochs that only the geological strata retain the memory. This leads to another avenue of inquiry, one that focuses not on the physical manifestations of prior life, but on the chemical signatures they might have imprinted, concealed within the very essence of Earth's most ancient materials. When you consider it, every human endeavor leaves a chemical trace. Every combustion yields smoke, laden with specific compounds. Every industrial facility disperses byproducts into the atmosphere, soil, or water. Every mining operation perturbs the equilibrium of subterranean minerals. These vestiges do not simply dissipate. They migrate through the environment, settle into sedimentary deposits, and occasionally become permanently embedded within the geological structure for durations far exceeding human history. Even natural phenomena such as volcanic eruptions, riverine inundations, and glacial erosion leave behind their own unique chemical signatures. The Earth is stratified with these markers, each narrating a segment of what transpired and when. This is why researchers seeking indications of a long vanished civilization frequently consider chemistry with the same seriousness as fossils or artifacts. A chemical signature can endure where physical structures have succumbed to decay. It can traverse greater distances than skeletal remains or implements. It can outlast even the species responsible for its creation, resting quiescently within a stratum of rock until it is measured. The crux of the matter is discerning what constitutes an anomaly, what pattern is improbable as a result of purely natural forces. We have already generated such patterns ourselves. The Industrial Revolution left quantifiable elevations of certain heavy metals like lead, copper, and zinc in terrestrial soils and sedimentary deposits across the globe. The middle of the 20th century yielded an even more pronounced layer. The residual radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing, which disperse them worldwide. These isotopes possess half-lives spanning thousands to millions of years, meaning they will remain detectable for considerably longer than our edifices, or even many of our fossilized skeletal remains. Future investigators, whether human or of an entirely different nature, will readily identify the geological layer marking our era. But imagine you were to search for an earlier manifestation of such a chemical anomaly. You would not anticipate discovering precisely the same pattern. A different civilization might have harnessed energy sources we never conceived of, or processed materials we have never encountered. Instead, your focus would be on deviations, combinations of elements or isotopes that are uncommon in nature, but prevalent in specific industrial or technological activities. You would also need to eliminate natural occurrences that could produce similar outcomes, such as volcanic expulsions or celestial impacts. Volcanoes, for instance, can release significant quantities of sulfur, mercury, and other elements into the environment. However, volcanic deposits typically exhibit distinct proportions of these elements and are often concentrated in proximity to the eruption site. Conversely, emissions from a civilization might be dispersed over vast territories, carried by atmospheric currents and oceanic flows, appearing concurrently in multiple disparate locations. Similarly, meteor impacts can scatter precious metals like iridium, but they also leave unmistakable physical evidence, such as shock-altered quartz or a crater, that differentiates them from other sources. Another potential chemical imprint is the extensive modification of carbon isotopes. Flora, fauna, and fossilized fuels all possess characteristic ratios of the lighter and heavier carbon variants. When humanity combusts fossil fuels, we alter the equilibrium of these isotopes in the atmosphere and oceans, a shift that is recorded in tree rings, ice cores, and marine sediments. If a preceding civilization had consumed vast quantities of fossil carbon, whether in the form of coal, oil, or some other derivative, the isotopic record might exhibit a comparable pattern. The distinction would lie in the temporal sequence depth and context. An abrupt surge in carbon isotopes, devoid of natural causation, such as widespread volcanic activity, could indicate that something extraordinary occurred. Mining operations can also leave a distinct imprint. The extraction of metals from ore frequently leads to the concentration of specific elements in refuse heaps or tailings. Over time, these can infiltrate the soil and water, creating localized chemical anomalies. If those anomalies are preserved within sedimentary layers, they might endure for millions of years. An unusually elevated concentration of a metal that is scarce in the surrounding rock could be among the most unambiguous indicators of deliberate extraction. The challenge lies in pinpointing these anomalies initially. They might be buried deep beneath more recent strata or concealed within regions that have not been thoroughly investigated. It is also worthwhile to consider what kinds of materials an earlier civilization might have manufactured that are absent from nature. We have produced plastics, synthetic rubbers, and a diverse array of polymers that simply did not exist previously. Many of these materials are resistant to degradation, at least on human timescales, and they tend to fragment into microscopic particles rather than vanishing entirely. Over millions of years, they might undergo chemical transformations, but their fundamental composition could remain identifiable as artificial. If a prior civilization possessed its own equivalent synthetic compounds, dissimilar to anything found in nature, those could serve as unmistakable markers, provided they survived in a recognizable form. One of the compelling aspects of chemical fingerprints is their frequent convergence with other forms of evidence. A variation in pollen types within a sediment core might correspond with an increase in specific metals, suggesting that land clearing and mining occurred concurrently. A spike in carbon isotopes might align with layers rich in ash, pointing to widespread combustion. These types of correlations strengthen the argument because they imply multiple interconnected activities rather than isolated natural events. Naturally, the absence of such evidence does not preclude the existence of a civilization, a culture that coexisted harmoniously with its environment, relying on renewable resources and eschewing large-scale extraction or combustion, might leave virtually no discernible chemical trace. Its legacy could dissolve into the background noise of natural fluctuations, indistinguishable from the planet's baseline patterns. In a sense, this is what renders the investigation both arduous and captivating. We are searching for indicators that could be as conspicuous as a neon sign or as subtle as a faint smudge in the data. Further complicating matters, the chemical record is not uniformly preserved. Certain environments excel at preserving chemical signatures. Deep ocean sediments, lakebeds, and ice cores can maintain stable records for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Others are perpetually disturbed, obliterating evidence almost as rapidly as it forms. Floodplains, coastlines, and shallow soils are in constant motion, intermingling ancient material with recent deposits. A civilization that primarily inhabited these dynamic zones might leave scant, enduring chemical traces, even if it possessed advanced technology. And then there is the matter of recognition. Even if we uncover a chemical anomaly, we must ascertain whether it is significant. We must compare it against the broader context of the planet's history. Is it unique to a particular time and place, or does it recur across multiple eras? Does it align with our understanding of natural cycles, or does it stand apart in a manner that demands an alternative explanation? In numerous instances, we may have already encountered anomalies that do not neatly fit established patterns. However, without the appropriate conceptual framework, we may have categorized them as curiosities rather than evidence of something extraordinary. If a lost civilization left its mark in this manner, it could be concealed in plain sight within samples already collected, in cores stored in laboratories, in data archived for decades. The challenge is to re examine them, to pose novel questions to existing evidence, and to remain receptive to interpretations we might have once dismissed. The chemical record is expansive, and our capacity to interpret it is continually advancing. New analytical techniques can detect elements and compounds at parts per trillion, revealing subtleties that would have been imperceptible a generation ago. With each enhancement, the probability increases that we might identify a pattern that deviates from the planet's natural rhythm. However, chemical traces, however compelling, represent only a portion of the narrative. To substantiate the existence of an ancient civilization, we would aim to integrate them with other forms of evidence, such as patterns in sedimentary layers, alterations in fossil distribution, and shifts in climatic data, which collectively form a picture too cohesive to disregard. And that investigation inevitably guides us to the few serious scientific endeavors attempting to confront this very possibility, the most noteworthy of which has come to be known as the Silurian hypothesis. When scientists discuss the Silurian hypothesis, they are not asserting that such a civilization definitively existed. It is not a declaration, but rather an exercise in contemplation. The concept was proposed as a means of inquiring whether, had an intelligent industrial society existed on Earth millions of years prior to humanity, we would possess the means to detect any evidence of it today. And if so, what would that evidence entail? The nomenclature itself originates from science fiction. In the 1970s, a British television program introduced a fictional species called the Silurians. These were depicted as intelligent reptilian beings, purportedly evolved on Earth long before humans emerged. The scientists who originated the term were not suggesting that the television backstory was factual. They were borrowing the designation as a light-hearted reference for a serious inquiry. They selected the Silurian hypothesis not because they believed such a civilization arose during the actual Silurian period, hundreds of millions of years ago, but because it encapsulates the central notion of searching for traces of intelligence that predated us significantly. The authors of the initial paper, Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank, were not paleontologists excavating fossils. Schmidt is a climate scientist and Frank is an astrophysicist. They approach the question from the vantage point of planetary science, specifically how civilizations, including hypothetical extraterrestrial ones, might leave enduring imprints on their worlds and how those imprints could be detected. Their work extended beyond Earth's history, aiming to establish a framework applicable to other planets we might investigate in the future. If Mars, for instance, had ever harbored intelligent life, what indications might we currently expect to discover? They commenced by observing that human industrial activities have already transformed the planet in ways that will persist for millions of years. We have altered the atmospheric composition, shifted the balance of carbon isotopes, dispersed synthetic compounds, and left chemical residues from mining and manufacturing. These transformations will be recorded in sediments, ice cores, and rock strata, thereby creating a distinct geological boundary, signifying the Anthropocene, the proposed designation for our present epoch. If an earlier civilization had undergone its own comparable phase of industrialization, Schmidt and Frank posited, analogous transformations might be discernible in the deep geological record. However, they also highlighted the inherent challenges. Over tens of millions of years, the Earth's surface undergoes continuous recycling. Erosion, subduction, and the slow churning of the crust obliterate most evidence. Structures decay, metals corrode, and even stable compounds eventually break down. The more ancient the civilization, the less likely its direct artifacts would endure. This is why their focus shifted to indirect evidence, particularly chemical and isotopic signals. Industrial operations tend to generate combinations and concentrations of elements that do not occur naturally, or at least not in identical patterns. Large-scale agricultural practices can alter the distribution of plant species and modify soils in ways that persist. The consumption of fossil fuels can shift carbon isotope ratios in a manner difficult to replicate through purely natural processes. These are the types of markers that might outlast the civilization itself, entombed in rock strata long after its metropolises have crumbled. The hypothesis also compels us to re-examine our preconceptions about what constitutes civilization. We envision cities, roadways, and monuments, but these are products of our biology and environment. A non-human civilization might have manifested in a vastly different form, leaving far fewer durable vestiges. If it subsisted on organic materials, renewable energy sources, and decentralized settlements, its signature in the geological record might be faint. If it existed in a geologically unstable region, even that subtle signal could be entirely obliterated. To test this concept, Schmidt and Frank sought examples of abrupt alterations in the geological record, spikes in specific elements, shifts in isotope ratios, unexplained climatic events that might bear resemblance to modern human impacts. Some of these changes could be attributed to natural causes like volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts. Others remain less certain, but even the unexplained instances do not constitute proof. They are merely anomalies, whose significance remains open to interpretation. One of the points they emphasized was that our own history serves as a cautionary example. If our civilization were to vanish tomorrow, the traces we have left would be evident for a period, but they would not endure indefinitely. After a few million years, virtually all of our physical structures would be gone. Only the chemical and isotopic alterations would persist, and even those would diminish with sufficient time. The greater the depth of burial, the higher the probability that heat and pressure would completely erase the signal. This perspective alters how one approaches the search for ancient civilizations. It redirects the focus from seeking physical ruins to interpreting the planet's chemistry. It also broadens the temporal scope. Instead of confining our imagination to the last few thousand or million years, we can entertain the possibility that civilization-like activity might have occurred hundreds of millions of years ago, during an era when continents were arranged differently, the climate was unfamiliar, and the dominant species were unlike any alive today. The Silurian hypothesis does not assert that such a civilization existed. It is more about delineating the boundaries of what we could ascertain. It acknowledges that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, yet it also establishes parameters. There are types of evidence we might anticipate surviving, and if we do not find them, that informs us about the probability of certain scenarios. It is a method of transforming a speculative question into something empirically verifiable, albeit a challenging test. And it is not solely concerned with the past. The same principles apply when contemplating the future of our own species. If we endure for another million years, how will our signature in the rock record compare to what we have already created? If we vanish sooner, how rapidly will the planet erase our traces? And if we search for signs of life on other planets and moons, will we recognize the signals emanating from civilizations that might be profoundly different from our own? The Silurian hypothesis functions, in a way, as a mirror. It prompts us to examine our own impact on Earth and to envision it from the perspective of an observer or entity studying it millions of years hence. It reminds us that we are not the first living entities to shape this planet, and perhaps not the first to do so in ways that could be termed civilized. It also impresses upon us that time is a formidable agent of erasure, capable of smoothing away even the sharpest distinctions, leaving only the faintest echoes for the inquisitive to discover. And if there exists even a remote possibility that echoes from a forgotten civilization still linger, awaiting recognition, then the question naturally arises: if they possessed language, if they had culture, if they communicated across the ages, would we even be capable of comprehending them now? When we discuss communication in the context of a lost civilization, it is easy to envision something familiar. Written symbols inscribed on a surface, sounds articulated into words, gestures with shared meaning. This is how we define language because it is how we employ it. However, the reality is that language is simply a structured method of conveying information, and it can manifest in forms that bear no resemblance to anything humans have ever produced. If a civilization preceded ours, it is entirely conceivable that its communication system would be so disparate from our own that even if we chanced upon a record of it, we would fail to recognize it as language. Language is fundamentally shaped by biology. The manner in which humans articulate speech is dictated by our vocal apparatus, lungs expelling air, vocal cords vibrating, the interplay of the tongue and lips in shaping the sound. Our auditory range influences the frequencies we utilize, and our visual acuity assists us in comprehending written forms and nonverbal cues. A non-human civilization could have been constituted by beings with entirely different sensory ranges and anatomical structures. If they relied on frequencies beyond our audible spectrum, we might never detect their vocal exchanges without specialized instruments. If their visual communication employed colors outside the human spectrum of perception, any remnants could appear entirely meaningless to us. Even within our own world, we observe a diverse array of communication strategies. Dolphins utilize bursts of sound that vary in pitch, duration, and pattern, potentially encoding intricate messages. Cephalopods, such as octopuses and cuttlefish, alter the color and texture of their skin in rapid, complex patterns that can instantaneously convey information to others of their kind. Bees perform dances to inform hive mates about the direction and distance of food sources. Ants employ chemical trails, depositing pheromones that other ants can interpret. Each of these systems is tailored to the capabilities and requirements of the species employing it. Should we encounter the remnants of such systems without the living organisms to demonstrate their functionality, our capacity for interpretation would be severely constrained. Imagine discovering a fossilized octopus without any comprehension of how it once communicated through color modulations. You might be able to analyze the composition of skin, even determine the coloration, but without witnessing its function, its true essence would remain inaccessible. The same principle applies to the remnants of a forgotten society. Lacking an understanding of the sensory environment they inhabited, the physical manifestations of their communication might prove utterly bewildering. Our conventional notions of written language present their own set of hurdles. We instinctively search for recurring symbols, uniform spacing, and discernible sequences as indicators of a symbolic system. However, these are products of our own cognitive biases and technological limitations. An extraterrestrial form of writing could be nonlinear, potentially existing in multiple dimensions, integrating spatial configurations, tactile qualities, and even chemical signatures. It might be engineered for revelation only under specific circumstances, perhaps submerged in liquid, observed with ultraviolet light, or felt through microscopic patterns. Without the appropriate interpretive framework, such a system could easily be dismissed as mere arbitrary markings, geological deposits, or biological formations. Even if we identified a system as a form of symbolic expression, deciphering its meaning would pose an immense challenge. The breakthroughs in understanding ancient human scripts typically stem from the discovery of a parallel text, a Rosetta Stone, which conveys the same message in multiple languages, at least one of which is familiar. Absent such a key, translation can take decades, even for closely related human tongues. For a non-human language, the conceptual chasm could be exponentially greater. Concepts fundamental to their culture might have no parallel in our own. Their vocabulary could be rooted in sensory experiences beyond our capacity, or in social constructs entirely foreign to us. It's also conceivable that they didn't employ discrete linguistic units in the manner we do. Some contemporary animal communication appears to rely on continuous modulation rather than distinct symbols. A gradient of sound, hue, or chemical concentration conveys meaning through subtle fluctuations. Deciphering such a system would necessitate not only recognizing its existence, but comprehending the context of its application. Without that context, we might readily mistake it for ambient environmental noise. One of the more humbling facets of this contemplation is the possibility that we may have already encountered the vestiges of a non-human language and failed to perceive it. Patterns within ancient geological strata, arrangements of shells or stones, or recurring chemical anomalies could be attributed to natural processes because we lack the conceptual scaffolding to interpret them as deliberate. We might be gazing directly at the equivalent of a sentence or narrative, utterly devoid of comprehension. Conversely, should we identify a pattern suggesting intentionality, the subsequent step of understanding would represent another significant leap. Elucidating meaning requires correlating symbols with real world reference. This is feasible only by making informed estimations about the subject matter. With human languages, we frequently initiate with proper nouns, numerical figures, or descriptions of familiar occurrences. For a vanished non human civilization, these reference points might be non existent. The appellations within their records could pertain to places or species long extinct. Their accounts of natural phenomena might depict climates or landscapes bearing no resemblance to our present reality. Furthermore, there exists the possibility that their communication system was never intended for permanence. Humans commit information to durable mediums, stone, clay, metal, digital storage, precisely to ensure its longevity. However, another species might have prioritized impermanence, utilizing signals designed to dissipate rapidly, existing solely during their immediate exchange. A language based on sensory emissions, for example, might linger for hours or days at most, vanishing without a trace. In such a scenario, the sole evidence of their communicative activity might be discovered indirectly, through the biological adaptations that enabled them to produce and detect these signals, even if we never decipher their specific utterances. The very existence of a language would impart profound insight. It would signify their possession of the cognitive faculties to share abstract concepts, to coordinate efforts, to strategize for the future, and to contemplate the past. Language stands as one of the most potent indicators of intelligence because it facilitates the transmission of intricate information across temporal divides and between generations. It provides a mechanism for externalizing thoughts, whether through symbols, performances, or shared recollections. If a pre-human civilization possessed such a system, it would have profoundly shaped every facet of their society. Their methods of obtaining sustenance, the formation of social connections, and the transfer of accumulated knowledge would all have been influenced. It might even have impacted the evolutionary trajectory of their brains and physiology, favoring individuals adept at generating and interpreting the language. This evolutionary pressure could leave discernible marks in the fossil record, manifesting as specialized sensory organs or distinct neural structures. Nevertheless, recognizing these features would still depend on knowing what to look for. Considering all these factors, the question of our ability to comprehend them becomes even more intricate. It transcends the mere act of linguistic translation. It involves bridging an entire gulf of sensory and cultural experience. We would need to reconstruct not only their language, but also the universe it illuminated, and that might prove to be the most formidable undertaking of all. As the further we delve into the past, the more alien that world becomes. Nevertheless, when we envision such a civilization, it is difficult not to also imagine them possessing some form of artistic expression, narrative tradition, or cultural output extending beyond mere survival. And if they did, then perhaps concealed or altered beyond easy identification, remnants of a creative existence we had never conceived might lie hidden. Art, as we understand it, is one of the most direct reflections of a mind capable of imaginative thought. It's a method of externalizing an internal conception, an image, a story, an emotion, so that it can be shared by others. We tend to consider it a uniquely human attribute. Yet, even in our present era, there are indications that other species create for reasons extending beyond immediate necessity. Bowerbirds construct elaborate structures adorned with vividly colored objects, arranged with an inherent sense of symmetry and pattern. Whales produce complex, evolving songs that do not appear to serve a purely functional purpose. Primates occasionally create marks or arrange objects in ways that seemingly lack direct utility. These behaviors suggest that the drive to create, to fashion something aesthetically pleasing or expressive, may not be exclusive to humanity. If a civilization predated our own, it is not unreasonable to surmise that they cultivated their own unique art forms, expressions that played no direct role in their sustenance or shelter, but which enriched their lives in ways we might find familiar. The challenge lies in the inherent fragility of most artistic endeavors. Pigments fade, wood decomposes, fabrics disintegrate. Even sculpted stone can be eroded by the elements or buried beneath shifting sediment. Over millions of years, the overwhelming majority of human artistic creations would vanish without a trace. It is highly probable that the same fate would befall any earlier civilization. The survival of surviving ancient human art is often attributable to extraordinary circumstances. Caves that shielded paintings from the elements, arid deserts that preserved carvings, volcanic ash that entombed entire settlements. If an earlier civilization produced their art in less protected locales, the likelihood of its preservation becomes infinitesimally small. Even the selection of materials would be a critical factor. If they utilized organic dyes or pigments derived from swiftly decaying plants and minerals, no visible evidence would remain. If they favored performance over permanence, music, dance, or ephemeral installations, then their art would have ceased to exist the moment it was experienced. This does not necessarily mean it would be entirely imperceptible to us now. Certain artistic activities can leave indirect clues. The pigments used in painting might persist as traces of uncommon minerals within soil layers. Sculptures or decorative elements carved into durable stone could endure if they were deeply buried or sheltered within stable rock formations. Adornments or ornamental objects fashioned from resilient materials like certain stones, shells, or metals might outlast their creators, though they could easily be mistaken for natural formations or rudimentary tools if their intended purpose was unclear. Furthermore, there is the question of whether their artistic creations would even be recognizable to us as art. Art is inextricably linked to the sensory and cultural milieu of its originator. What one species perceives as beautiful might hold no significance for another. Colors we deem vibrant could be imperceptible to them, while patterns they found captivating might be undetectable to our senses. Their conception of rhythm could be based on tempos we find difficult to perceive or replicate. An arrangement of objects imbued with profound symbolic meaning for them might appear haphazard to us without an understanding of the cultural context. We could inadvertently pass by their masterpieces without recognizing their significance. It is important to remember that even among humans, art originating from distant cultures or historical periods can present interpretive challenges. Ancient geometric carvings, abstract designs, and symbolic motifs can perplex archaeologists for decades. We may acknowledge their intentionality and importance, but their precise meaning often remains a subject of speculation. Multiply that difficulty by a completely divergent evolutionary trajectory, and one can readily appreciate how easily the meaning of non-human art could be irretrievably lost. There is also the possibility that their artistic traditions were intrinsically connected to environments that are seldom explored in the archaeological record. If their primary habitat was coastal, a significant portion of their art could now lie submerged due to fluctuations in sea level. If they inhabited forested regions, their creations might have been rapidly consumed by vegetation and decay. If their dwelling places were subterranean or within caves, their art might still exist in concealed chambers yet to be discovered. However, locating it would necessitate precise knowledge of where to search. And when considering the potential nature of such art, it is beneficial to move beyond our conventional classifications of painting, sculpture, and music. Their creative outputs might have involved living organisms, with plants cultivated into deliberate forms, bioluminescent organisms arranged to create luminous displays, or seasonal spectacles composed of migratory fauna or blooming flora. They might have manipulated sound in ways that we cannot easily replicate, employing frequencies or resonances that, while not propagating effectively through our atmosphere, were perfectly suited to theirs. They could have produced tactile art intended for feeling rather than sight, or sensory experiences designed to evoke memory and emotion. If any of these left a physical imprint, it might be subtle. Altered growth patterns in fossilized vegetation, unusual arrangements of shells or stones within ancient sediment layers, microscopic wear marks on implements used for carving or shaping. Without the understanding that these were created for aesthetic rather than utilitarian purposes, we might simply categorize them as anomalies. The drive to create also intersects with the imperative to record. If they possessed narratives, histories, or myths, art could have served as one of their methods for preserving and transmitting this information. A sculpture might have represented a cultural hero or a foundational creation story. A sequence of patterns could have encoded astronomical observations or cyclical seasonal events. An arrangement of objects might have marked a significant occurrence or served as a commemorative monument. Even if we were unable to decipher these meanings, the very act of their creation would indicate a consciousness concerned with more than immediate necessities. In the absence of direct witnesses, their art transforms from a personal or cultural expression into a potential message across time. Whether or not they intended it as such, it represents one of the few phenomena that could have possessed the capacity to endure beyond their existence. The fact that we have not yet unearthed such a message does not preclude its existence. It might simply signify that we have not yet recognized it for what it is. The Earth is an immense expanse, and our exploration of its most ancient geological layers is still in its nascent stages. Observing our own species, we can perceive how art shapes identity and community. It is plausible that for them as well, the act of creation fostered social cohesion, encouraged collaboration, and provided a sense of continuity across generations. Even if their art never extended beyond their immediate environment, it would have been a defining characteristic of their identity. The tragedy, if one can label it as such, is that without an observer to witness and comprehend it, that aspect of their identity would vanish as completely as the art itself. Yet the absence of surviving works does not negate the probability that they existed. Just as we infer the presence of ancient languages from the sophistication of a society's tools or its social structures, we might one day infer the existence of non human art from other indicators, a level of cultural advancement that virtually necessitates an aesthetic dimension. However, to reach that point, we must first contemplate how such a society might have emerged, how it might have thrived, and ultimately, how it might have met its end. The narrative of any civilization, whether factual or hypothetical, is a chronicle of transformation. It commences with the conditions that permit its genesis. It evolves through the forces that foster its growth, and it concludes or transmutes when those conditions shift beyond its capacity to adapt. This pattern is not exclusive to humanity. It is imprinted in the history of countless societies across our planet. And it is reasonable to surmise that if another civilization existed long before our own, it likely followed a similar arc. To ascend, a civilization requires more than mere intelligence. It necessitates an environment sufficiently stable to support development. It demands access to resources, sustenance, materials, energy, and an efficient means of managing them. It requires cooperation among its members, which could be propelled by social bonds, mutual advantage, or a shared sense of purpose. If our imagined pre-human civilization was predominantly marine, they might have depended on stable oceanic currents, abundant fisheries, and predictable migratory patterns of their prey. If they were terrestrial, perhaps they emerged in a region characterized by fertile soil, a temperate climate, and proximity to mineral-rich hills or forests teeming with useful flora. Once these foundational elements are in place, the subsequent phase involves specialization. Individuals or groups begin to assume distinct roles: gatherers of food, crafters of tools, builders, storytellers, navigators. Specialization fosters efficiency and innovation, as each role can undergo refinement and improvement over successive generations. This is the stage where traditions begin to take root, encompassing not only cultural and ideological norms, but also technological and procedural practices. The knowledge of how to construct a particular type of dwelling, hunt using a specific method, or navigate by certain celestial bodies becomes an integral part of the collective inheritance. Growth also typically engenders complexity. As populations increase, greater coordination becomes essential for the equitable distribution of resources, the resolution of disputes, and the maintenance of order. Leadership structures may materialize, whether formally or informally, centrally or distributively. This can represent a period of profound creativity, during which a society's core values are codified into systems that shape its future trajectory. For a pre-human civilization, these systems might have been preserved in oral traditions, ritualistic practices, or symbolic art. Alternatively, they could have been inscribed in a medium yet to be recognized as such. As their influence expanded, they might have ventured into new environments, adapting their lifestyles to varying conditions. Coastal populations could have migrated inland. Riverine dwellers might have ventured into the open ocean. Forest dwellers could have acquired the skills to survive on expansive plains. This expansion could facilitate interaction with other groups, whether of their own species or entirely different intelligent lineages. Cooperation might lead to trade and the exchange of ideas. Competition could result in conflict and innovation spurred by necessity. However, with growth comes inherent vulnerability. The larger and more interconnected a civilization becomes, the more reliant it is on stable conditions. Environmental shifts, alterations in food availability, or geological disturbances could propagate throughout the entire system. For a marine society, changes in water temperature or oceanic currents could devastate their primary food sources. For a terrestrial one, prolonged drought or excessive flooding could lead to agricultural collapse. These are pressures we can comprehend because our own history is replete with similar events. Furthermore, there is the potential for self induced instability, excessive resource depletion, environmental degradation, or internal strife can undermine the very mechanisms that enabled a society to flourish. Without meticulous stewardship, a civilization can reach a critical threshold where its demands exceed the capacity of its environment to provide. From that point onward, decline can be rapid or gradual, but it is frequently irreversible. If this hypothetical pre-human civilization possessed technology comparable to or exceeding our own, the associated risks might have been even more significant. Advanced implements can enable swift expansion and exploitation, but they can also amplify the consequences of missteps. A poorly managed energy source, a destructive conflict, or an environmental catastrophe triggered by industrial activities could have resulted in repercussions beyond their ability to rectify. When decline commences, it does not invariably signify a sudden collapse. At times, it manifests as a slow retrenchment, a reduction in settlements, diminished trade, the erosion of specialized skills, the fading of traditions, the deterioration of infrastructure, and knowledge once commonplace becoming scarce. In human history, we observe instances of societies that contracted to a fraction of their former scale, persisting in isolated enclaves while their former territories were reclaimed by nature. For a civilization existing millions of years in the past, the eventual disappearance of these final bastions would obliterate the last living memory of their achievements. The downfall might also have been precipitated by events entirely beyond their control. A significant asteroid impact could have induced a global climatic shift. Extensive volcanic eruptions might have inundated the atmosphere with ash and sulfur, cooling the planet and disrupting ecosystems. Tectonic plate movements could have submerged entire land masses or irrevocably altered coastlines. In such circumstances, even a well-managed civilization could have been overwhelmed. Whatever the cause, the conclusion of a civilization marks the commencement of its transition into history, and over sufficient time, into mystery, as physical vestiges begin to erode. Structures crumble, implements corrode, art decays, organic materials dissipate rapidly, while even the most enduring constructions are eventually buried, fractured, or worn away. Within the vast temporal scales we are considering, the overwhelming majority of their creations would not survive. What remains might be fragmented, dispersed, and ambiguous. But even in its absence, the memory of their existence could resonate within the world they left behind. Alterations to ecosystems, genetic legacies within domesticated species, shifts in the distribution of specific minerals or chemical compounds. These could persist long after the civilization itself had vanished. These echoes might be faint, but they would still be present for those attuned to their subtle signals. And if these echoes are faint now, it may be because they were obscured by something even more profound. For in the deep past, the earth has undergone periods when life itself was nearly extinguished. when the slate was almost entirely wiped clean, leaving only the survivors to carry forward. If a civilization predated ours, it might have met its demise during one of these cataclysmic episodes, disappearing not merely from historical record, but from the very fabric of the biosphere. There is a peculiar form of introspection that arises when contemplating the distant past. We begin with the notion of looking backward, examining the traces of what might have been. However, at some juncture, imperceptibly, we find ourselves viewing our own world, our current historical epoch, through the prism of what we imagine could have transpired previously. It is as if the ancient earth is holding a mirror before us, and within the faint, hypothetical outlines of a long vanished civilization, we discern reflections of ourselves. In that mirror, temporal dimensions stretch and contort in ways that diminish the perceived magnitude of the present. Consider the possibility of another kind of life inhabiting this planet, or its waters, or soaring through its atmosphere, existing for millions of years before our earliest ancestors were even a glimmer of an idea in the grand scheme of evolution. They would have had their own origins, their own periods of hardship and breakthroughs, their own adeptness at managing their surroundings. And it's conceivable they grappled with challenges akin to our own: limitations in resources, environmental transformations, internal strife, and the unpredictable nature of technological advancement. It's easy to envision that some of their deliberations, anxieties, and aspirations might resonate with us, even if their societal structures were entirely foreign. This line of thought transcends mere idle speculation. It serves as a means to break free from the notion that our journey is uniquely singular. We often perceive our current era as the central point in history, as if intelligence and technology are exceedingly rare marvels that have only recently materialized. However, by allowing ourselves to visualize beings who preceded us, we must confront the prospect that entire civilizations are not isolated occurrences. They may represent recurring phenomena in a planet's existence, emerging and fading over vast geological epochs, each as convinced of its enduring presence as we are now. This realization can be disquieting. It tempers our self importance and introduces uncertainty about the future. If another species occupied our current position, believing they had conquered the secret to survival, yet they are no longer present, what does this imply for our prospects? This need not be a despairing perspective. It can be a sobering one, a reminder that the perseverance of a civilization hinges on more than mere intellect or technological prowess. It relies on an equilibrium between expansion and conservation, between boldness and prudence, and between the immediate needs of the present and the long-term requirements of the future. This parallel perspective also functions in the reverse, by considering how a civilization from the distant past might appear to us today: fragmented, incomplete, often indistinguishable from the surrounding natural landscape. We can better conceptualize how we might be perceived by those who come after us. What evidence would they find in the geological strata of our time? How much of what we consider fundamental to our identity would remain discernible? And if our own indicators eventually dwindle to mere unusual sediment layers and dispersed chemical residues, would future minds be capable of grasping the full complexity of our world? This mental exercise can alter our perception of our present-day impact. A stratum abundant in plastics, isotopes, and altered carbon concentrations might one day serve as the most recognizable testament to our existence, even if our cities and cultures have long since dissolved. In such a scenario, our most enduring legacy might not be our artistic creations, scientific discoveries, or technological innovations, but rather the indelible mark we have imprinted upon the physical planet itself. The same could hold true for the civilization we envision in the past. Perhaps what endures of them is not their grandest accomplishment, but their most lasting modification of the earth. Naturally, a mirror can both illuminate and distort. We tend to project our own values and preoccupations onto this imagined past, shaping it into a form that feels sufficiently familiar for our contemplation. It is entirely plausible that a pre-human civilization would have been so fundamentally different from us in terms of biology, psychology, and societal organization that our comparisons would be largely irrelevant. Their conception of advancement could have been entirely distinct from our own. They might not have prioritized expansion, acquisition, or dominion over nature. They might have measured prosperity in cyclical terms rather than linear progression, in balance rather than relentless growth. If this were the case, their ascendancy and subsequent decline might not conform to any patterns we anticipate. Nevertheless, even with variations in specifics, the overarching rhythm of emergence, flourishing, and decay could be a universal principle. This rhythm is inherent in the nature of living systems, which thrive under particular conditions and falter when those conditions shift excessively or too rapidly. This applies equally to forests, coral reefs, and civilizations, whether human or otherwise. The environmental parameters conducive to life are in constant flux, and every adaptation is inherently transient. When contemplating the deep past through this lens, the lines between imagination and scientific inquiry become blurred. We lack direct empirical evidence of another civilization predating our own. However, we do possess evidence of the forces that shape and obliterate. We understand how landscapes transform, how climatic patterns can shift from stability to volatility, and how resources can become depleted. We are aware of the inherent fragility of our own systems when subjected to extreme stress. This knowledge does not confirm the existence of predecessors, but it suggests that had they existed, their fate might have been dictated by the same pressures that will eventually test us. Gazing into this mirror also serves as a reminder that time itself is the ultimate editor. It systematically removes the vast majority of details, leaving only a select few fragments for future generations to interpret. In the case of our hypothetical ancestors, this editorial process has been severe. Tens or hundreds of millions of years of erosion, geological subduction, chemical alteration, and biological decomposition. If they were once present, virtually all traces have been eradicated. The same fate awaits us. The crucial question is whether the surviving fragments will narrate a story of resilience, of adaptability, or of downfall. There is a peculiar sense of solace in this perspective. It positions us within a vast continuum, not as the apex of evolution, but as one manifestation among many. It does not diminish our accomplishments, but rather frames them as integral components of a grander, more ancient design. In doing so, it prompts us to consider more thoughtfully what we choose to bequeath to posterity. This encompasses not only our material footprint, but also the nature of the world we fashion for those who may follow. If we could peer through that reflective surface and observe the civilization we imagine, perhaps we would learn lessons that they themselves learned too late. Or perhaps they would learn from our example, observing whether we managed to navigate the challenges that proved insurmountable for them. In either scenario, the reflection compels a fundamental question. If the pattern of ascent and decline is inherent in the very fabric of civilizations, is there a means to transcend it? Or is this cycle as inescapable as the Earth's rotation? And if it is unavoidable, then perhaps the most enduring connection we can forge with a civilization from the remote past is not through direct contact, but through a shared experience. Two distinct societies, separated by millions of years, both navigating the precarious path between flourishing and fading, each oblivious to the other's existence, yet bound by the same fundamental principles of survival. When we discuss the theoretical possibility of other civilizations in Earth's distant past, the concept often feels like an isolated mental exercise. However, the more one examines the cyclical patterns of life across hundreds of millions of years, the more it begins to resemble an inquiry into overarching principles rather than isolated incidents. Because if intelligence emerged once in our lineage, why should it have been the inaugural and sole instance? And if it has occurred more than once, could there be a recurring cycle, a repeated emergence of consciousness capable of intentionally and significantly shaping the planet? Intelligence in its purest form is not synonymous with civilization. The animal kingdom abounds with creatures exhibiting remarkable problem solving abilities, memory retention, and adaptability, all without constructing cities or developing industries. For example, octopuses can successfully navigate labyrinths and utilize tools. Crows fashion rudimentary hooks from twigs to extract food from confined spaces. Elephants exhibit intricate social structures and appear to mourn their deceased. None of these species has established a global infrastructure. However, they demonstrate that intelligence, in its fundamental sense, is not an uncommon trait. It evolves when it serves a practical purpose. Civilization, on the other hand, represents something distinct. It is intelligence applied to collective endeavors of long term significance. It involves the coordination of substantial groups towards shared objectives, the advancement of technologies that yield compounding benefits over time, and the capacity to modify the environment to an extent far beyond individual capabilities. This confluence of intelligence, cooperation, and technology is considerably rarer, at least within the known fossil record. Yet, rarity does not equate to impossibility. On Earth, complex life has existed for upwards of 500 million years. Throughout this extensive period, there have been multiple surges of evolutionary innovation. Entirely novel body plans materialized. During the Cambrian explosion, terrestrial flora dramatically altered the atmospheric composition. Vertebrates transitioned from aquatic environments to land, and in certain evolutionary branches, even returned to water. Flight independently evolved in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. Each of these transformations did not occur just once, but multiple times, manifesting in diverse forms and across different species. So, why should civilization be any different? It may be that given sufficient time, the combination of intelligence, cooperation, and technology reemerges repeatedly, much like the evolution of flight or vision. The trajectory of this emergence might differ each time, influenced by the specific environmental context and the evolutionary lineage involved. But the ultimate outcome, a species capable of reorganizing its surroundings, could be a recurring phenomenon. If this is the case, then our current experience is not unique in its fundamental nature, only in its specific details. We may be the most recent in a succession of civilizations that have risen, thrived, and subsequently vanished, each leaving behind traces that diminish with the passage of time. And if the remnants of our own era will eventually prove challenging to detect, how much more difficult would it be to identify those of a civilization that existed tens or hundreds of millions of years ago? It is not difficult to conceptualize such a cyclical process unfolding repeatedly. A novel form of intelligence arises, adapting to the world it encounters. It discovers methods to manipulate its environment, enhancing comfort, security, and resource availability. As its population and capabilities expand, it develops tools and infrastructure, disseminates across diverse habitats, and modifies the planet on a scale observable even from orbit. For a period, it prospers, but inevitably, it confronts similar limitations: environmental shifts, resource depletion, internal instability, or catastrophic external events. Some cycles may conclude abruptly, with sudden collapses triggered by overwhelming disasters. Others might fade gradually, with declining populations and unraveling complexity over centuries or millennia. Regardless of the specific mechanism, the outcome remains consistent. The civilization ceases to exist, leaving the planet to recover and reset. After a sufficiently extended interval, the process recommences with a different species, a distinct set of tools, and a divergent cultural trajectory. One reason this hypothesis is challenging to verify is that these cycles could be separated by immense gulfs of time. Between one civilization and the next, tens of millions of years could elapse, ample time for continental plates to shift, climates to undergo radical transformations, and virtually all physical evidence to disappear. Even if a few scattered artifacts were to survive, they might be buried so deeply or altered so extensively that they would be indistinguishable from natural geological formations. It is also conceivable that not every evolutionary cycle results in a technological civilization as we currently define it. Some intelligent species might pursue paths that minimize large-scale environmental impact, prioritizing stability over expansion. They might never develop sophisticated metallurgy or industrial power, not due to an inherent lack of capability, but because their cultural priorities lie elsewhere. Such civilizations could still experience periods of rise and fall, but their imprint on the geological record would be even more faint, possibly imperceptible to any future observer. If cycles of intelligence do exist, they prompt fundamental questions about their underlying drivers. Is there an inherent tendency within evolution that favors advanced intelligence over extended temporal scales? Or is it a rare convergence of chance events, a roll of the cosmic dice that doesn't occur frequently enough to establish a discernible pattern? And if it is a pattern, does it adhere to a measurable rhythm linked to planetary cycles, such as climatic fluctuations, tectonic reorganizations, or extinction events? Examining Earth's history, we can identify periods when such cyclical patterns might fit. Following each mass extinction event, life undergoes a resurgence characterized by increased diversity and innovation. These are moments when entirely new categories of organisms colonize ecological niches, sometimes developing unprecedented capabilities. If intelligence is one of the potential outcomes, then the aftermath of an extinction could serve as fertile ground for its evolution. In this context, catastrophic loss might not merely signify the end of civilizations, but could potentially pave the way for their successors. This possibility reframes our own position within the temporal continuum. If we are integral to a cyclical process, then our narrative is interwoven with those we will never encounter. We are inhabiting the interstitial space between what has passed and what may yet come. The traces we leave will serve as either a launching point or a cautionary reminder for some distant future intelligence. Whether they recognize our existence or not, we will be a part of their world, much as a hypothetical pre-human civilization might still be a part of ours through the alterations they imprinted on the planet. It also introduces the unsettling notion that these cycles may not necessarily lead to cumulative progress. The mere fact that one civilization emerges after another does not imply that each is more advanced than its predecessor. The prevailing environmental conditions at the time could favor different strengths, different priorities, and different technological applications. The cycle might resemble a wheel, continuously turning through variations on recurring themes, rather than a ladder ascending towards a definitive peak. If this is the case, then intelligence might be less of a linear progression towards an ultimate goal and more of a recurrent opportunity, one that can be seized or squandered, and which invariably carries an inherent expiration date. And as we contemplate the potential mechanisms of such cycles, we cannot avoid pondering what, if anything, endures between them. Could knowledge ever be transmitted from one cycle to the next? Could vestiges of a past intelligence somehow influence the emergence of a subsequent one? Or is the slate consistently wiped clean, forcing each new civilization to commence from scratch? The answer to this question might determine whether cycles of intelligence ultimately contribute to lasting planetary change, or whether they are merely transient waves in the grander ocean of Earth's history, leaving behind only faint ripples for the incurably curious to detect. This is not a contemplation most individuals engage in for extended periods. However, imagining the world devoid of our presence can be one of the most illuminating exercises for comprehending our own place within it. This applies not only in an abstract sense, but also in concrete detail. What would transpire if, by natural or other causes, our species were to vanish instantaneously? The streets would remain populated with vehicles, some lights would continue to function for a period, and the skies would still bear the faint trails of aircraft vapor. In that initial day, the difference might not be outwardly apparent from a distance, but a cascade of events would commence immediately. Within hours, systems reliant on continuous human oversight would begin to falter. Power grids would experience failures in segments as automated safety mechanisms activated without human intervention for resetting. Certain areas might persist longer than others, owing to backup power sources or self-regulating infrastructure, but a steady decline would be inevitable. Nuclear power facilities, without the presence of engineers to monitor them, would initiate shutdowns as safety protocols engaged. However, the management of spent nuclear fuel would present hazards for decades to come. Satellites would continue their orbital paths for years, some for centuries, before atmospheric drag eventually caused them to descend. Within days, the indicators of neglect would become increasingly difficult to overlook. Water treatment plants would cease operations, leading to contamination of rivers and reservoirs. Perishable goods in supermarkets and warehouses would begin to decompose, triggering population booms in rodents and insects. Domesticated animals would be left to their own devices. Some would adapt to the changed circumstances. Others would perish rapidly without the structures we had created to support them. The silence of human voices would be supplanted by the sounds of other species, expanding into territories we once dominated. Over weeks and months, the process of natural reclamation would accelerate. Vegetation would begin to breach cracks in asphalt and concrete. Without ongoing maintenance, drainage systems and gutters would become clogged, resulting in localized flooding in lower-lying regions. Wooden structures would commence their decay, while metallic components would succumb to rust in the humid, unventilated atmosphere. In some locations, wildlife would return in remarkable numbers, with wolves appearing on suburban streets, bears roaming abandoned neighborhoods, and birds nesting within the skeletal frameworks of office towers. Years into our absence, entire urban landscapes would undergo profound transformations. Buildings with extensive glass facades would collapse as the elements and the persistent growth of plant life weakened their structural integrity. Roadways would fragment under the relentless pressure of root systems and the cyclical stress of seasonal temperature fluctuations. Bridges would fail without routine inspection and repair. The monumental structures that define our era, the edifices we assume will endure for millennia, would be dismantled by the same slow-acting forces that gradually erode mountains over geological timescales. However, in this scenario, the rate of change would be considerably faster. Over decades, cities would gradually transform into forests, wetlands, and grasslands, depending on the prevailing climate and geographical characteristics. Rivers would reclaim their historical floodplains. Coastal zones would shift as tidal forces and storm surges reshaped the shorelines. The remnants of our industrial endeavors, steel mills, oil refineries, chemical manufacturing plants, would rust, leak, and ultimately be buried beneath accumulating sediment or become overgrown by vegetation. Our loftiest towers would be reduced to unrecognizable mounds of debris. However, certain materials would exhibit far greater longevity. Plastics, unless directly exposed to sunlight, could persist for hundreds or thousands of years, fragmenting into smaller particles but not undergoing complete decomposition. Glass, ceramics, and specific metal alloys would endure for even longer periods, albeit in a scattered and degraded state. The remains of subterranean infrastructure, including tunnels, pipelines, and foundations, might persist in some form for hundreds of thousands of years, shielded from the erosive effects of surface weathering. Even over these extended temporal scales, the vast majority of what characterizes our present world would fade. Written information, preserved on paper or in digital formats, would vanish relatively quickly without active conservation efforts. Digital archives would likely be lost within decades as storage media degraded. Stone inscriptions might survive for millennia, but they too would eventually succumb to erosion. in the absence of any entities to maintain their meaning. Even if fragments were to endure, they could become utterly indecipherable. From a geological perspective, the most enduring legacy would likely be chemical in nature. The carbon released from our consumption of fossil fuels would remain detectable in altered isotopic ratios within the rock strata for millions of years. Layers containing plastics, fly ash from coal combustion, and traces of synthetic compounds would form a distinct boundary recognizable to future geologists or future intelligent beings. These would constitute the telltale markers of a technologically advanced civilization, even if all visible structures had long since vanished, and the planet continued its rotation without us for tens of millions of years. These chemical markers would diminish in intensity, but not entirely disappear. Within certain ancient strata, an anomalous layer would exist, thin relative to the vastness of the geological column, yet distinctly identifiable. A sudden increase in carbon isotopes, the presence of long-lived synthetic molecules, microscopic fragments of manufactured products. This might represent the entirety of our enduring presence, compressed into a band no thicker than a human hand. What is striking about this hypothetical scenario is the rapidity with which most of our physical footprint would be erased. Despite our extensive use of concrete and steel, our sprawling metropolises and meticulously engineered landscapes, nature would reclaim the surface far more swiftly than we might prefer to acknowledge. It would be the subtle, microscopic, and chemical transformations that would persist. This, in turn, underscores the plausibility that if civilizations predated our own, their surface level traces could have been erased just as thoroughly. Contemplating our potential absence also compels us to consider what kind of imprint we wish to leave behind. At this very moment, we are actively shaping our future legacy, whether by conscious design or not. The materials we utilize, the energy sources we depend upon, and the manner in which we interact with ecological systems. These decisions will ultimately determine what remains discernible to any who study the earth long after our time has passed. Should the most lasting testament to our existence be the damage we inflict upon our environment, our narrative might be perceived in a drastically different light than how we ourselves would recount it. And there exists another perspective. The absence of humankind would not signify the perpetual absence of intelligence. Earth's historical record indicates that life has consistently recuperated from periods of widespread loss, frequently evolving into novel forms. In our hypothetical departure, the ecological niches we inhabit would become accessible to other species, some of which could potentially develop advanced intelligence over extended durations. This cycle might then recommence, much as we have often speculated it might have occurred previously. If that scenario proves true, those future minds, if capable, might one day reflect upon the faint traces we left behind and ponder our identity, just as we currently contemplate those who may have preceded us. There is a subtle solace to be found in the acknowledgement that not every inquiry yields a definitive answer. We are conditioned to view unresolved questions as challenges requiring a resolution, as voids in our comprehension that necessitate filling. And in numerous instances, this is indeed the case. Our pursuit of scientific knowledge and historical understanding is fundamentally driven by the desire to bridge these gaps. However, when confronting the profound depths of the past, particularly those epochs that might encompass extinct civilizations, a certain tranquility arises from allowing some questions to remain open. This is not solely about the allure of the unknown, although that certainly plays a role. It is about recognizing that mystery serves a purpose in shaping our perception of our place within the grand scheme of existence. Were we to meticulously chart every corner of history, to account for every ascendancy and decline, the past might feel like a completed volume, leaving nothing further to uncover, no room for imagination. And imagination, as much as factual data, is the wellspring of our inquisitiveness. We already inhabit a world replete with mysteries that are readily apparent. There exist ancient structures whose creators are known, yet whose motivations remain subjects of debate. We have unearthed fragmented remnants of languages whose complete meaning eludes us. We encounter fossilized species that reside at the very periphery of our evolutionary understanding. These enigmas serve to ground us in the realization that humanity's saga is intricate and incomplete. Now, let us extend this sentiment beyond the human narrative to an era where, if this notion holds true, we were entirely absent. Yet, it is conceivable that others might have been present. This contemplation invites a form of humility. We are accustomed to viewing ourselves as the initial and singular entity to achieve this level of complexity. To envision that others might have accomplished this long before us does not diminish our own achievements. It merely situates them within a more expansive context. We cease to be the sole architects of civilization on Earth, and instead become participants in a far more ancient and protracted tradition, even if its existence is only a suspicion. This tradition is founded upon the emergence of intelligence wherever conducive conditions permit, upon nature's experiments in cultivating minds capable of foresight, creation, and environmental alteration. And because we lack certainty regarding the existence of such predecessors, they remain unfettered within the realm of our imagination. They could have been denizens of the oceans, constructing sprawling cities resembling coral formations, or inhabitants of forests who collaborated with living trees to sculpt their abodes. They might have been diminutive and agile, relying on intricate communication networks rather than monumental edifices. Their appearance could have been entirely unlike our own. In their enigmatic nature, they can embody any degree of strangeness we desire, as we are constrained not by tangible evidence, but solely by what is plausible within the natural order. This flexibility also renders the concept beneficial. It can function as a mental exercise, a method for scrutinizing our assumptions about civilization. What elements are fundamental for a civilization to arise? How much of what we deem indispensable is merely a reflection of our specific biology and cultural conditioning? If another civilization could have flourished without the use of fire, without the invention of wheels, without metallurgical advancements, then perhaps our definitions are too restrictive. And if they were capable of generating beauty, stability, or knowledge without inflicting the kind of environmental devastation we are responsible for, then perhaps there is something within that imagined example that could offer us guidance. The comfort also stems from the understanding that certain mysteries can endure the ravages of time intact. In our world, there are occurrences and patterns that defy explanation, not due to a lack of effort on our part, but because the relevant evidence has vanished. Such is the nature of deep time. Geological strata are eroded, organic material is reintegrated into the ecosystem. Tectonic plates subduct entire continents beneath the crust. Over geological epochs, the physical record becomes selective, preserving merely a fraction of what once existed. If a civilization predated our own, the probabilities are overwhelmingly against our discovery of conclusive proof. However, this also implies that their story remains their own, uncolored by our interpretations. There is a certain magnanimity in that. Upon reflection, not every path needs to be reinterpreted by those who follow. Some can retain their integrity within their own temporal context, unobserved yet complete. When we conceive of them, we are not so much reconstructing a historical verity as we are forging a link between our present moment and an absence that we cannot bridge. This act of envisioning is its own reward. It refines our appreciation of what it means to exist, to leave an imprint, and eventually to be forgotten. Yet, the presence of mystery does not equate to isolation. Even in the absence of evidence, the notion of a past intelligence connects us to something grander than ourselves. It serves as a reminder that we share this planet with an extensive history of life, the majority of which has vanished, but all of which contributed to the conditions that currently sustain us. We are inheritors not merely of genetic material, but of landscapes sculpted by billions of years of interplay between life and the planet. In that regard, even a vanished civilization, whose existence we can never definitively prove, might still be considered part of our lineage, if only through the ways in which their presence or absence influence the trajectory of evolution. Maintaining a sense of mystery also preserves space for awe, something that definitive answers can sometimes diminish. It keeps us in the habit of posing speculative questions. It encourages exploration without the expectation of definitive discovery at the conclusion of every endeavor. This is a crucial mindset, as the universe will always present new inquiries, and we will not always possess the means or the time to address them all. Accepting this reality can transform the unknown from a source of frustration into a companion, something that accompanies us, shaping our thoughts and perceptions. From a practical standpoint, mystery can even offer protection. It prevents us from assuming we have reached the limits of possibility. If we were to firmly believe that we were the first and only intelligent species, we might also conclude that the demise of our civilization would signify the end of intelligence on Earth forever. However, if we entertain the possibility that others preceded us and that others may yet emerge, our perspective shifts. We transition from being the sole guardians of a rare flame to being a single link in a chain that may span vast expanses of time. This does not imply that our survival lacks significance. It simply means that our narrative is part of a larger tapestry. And perhaps therein lies the true comfort. We can strive to do our best, knowing that we are not starting from nothing and that we are not the final chapter in our planet's chronicle. Regardless of whether a pre-human civilization is ever conclusively proven to have existed, the mere contemplation of such a possibility is sufficient to prompt us to delve deeper into the past and to consider the future with greater thoughtfulness. It transforms the lack of evidence into a shared space where imagination and reality converge. It is a realm where scientific inquiry and curiosity meet without the pressure of immediate resolution. In this context, the mystery is not solely about them, it is about us. It pertains to how we choose to conduct our lives, knowing that one day we too will become part of someone else's unresolved questions. It is easy to become absorbed in the vast sweep of deep time, expending considerable energy contemplating hypothetical pasts or anticipated futures to the point where the present moment becomes a mere afterthought. However, upon stepping back from these temporal expanses and returning to our current reality, we discover something of value to hold on to. This is the singular point in history that we can directly experience. It is the only epoch where we are not forced to conjecture, where we do not rely on fragments or incomplete accounts. It is the sole segment of the narrative that we get to inhabit from within. At this very instant, we are the beneficiaries of every historical turn our planet has taken. We stand upon ground shaped by billions of years of geological processes, beneath a sky whose atmosphere has been modulated by countless generations of life that preceded us. The arrangement of continents, the chemical composition of the oceans, the atmospheric equilibrium of gases, none of these are happenstance. They are the culmination of all that has transpired before, including periods of extinction, subsequent recovery, and the quiescent intervals in between. The present moment is not an unblemished canvas, it is densely imbued with the momentum of the past and the potential for the future. Within it, we possess the knowledge and the instruments to comprehend the world to a far greater extent than any species before us. We can examine the distant past using satellites, microscopes, and chemical analyses. We can construct models of potential futures using equations and computer simulations. We can observe ourselves from orbit and recognize the alterations we have wrought upon the planet's surface in a mere handful of centuries. This level of self-awareness is rare in Earth's history, and likely rare in the history of any planet. Our presence here and now also confers upon us the capacity for choice. Our impact on the Earth is profound and rapidly escalating. This is an inescapable reality. However, the manner in which we wield this influence is not predetermined. We can elect to exacerbate the damage we cause, or we can choose to mitigate it. We can determine whether our enduring legacy will be a stark disruption in the geological record or a more subtle imprint that allows for subsequent developments. While the past is immutable, the future remains malleable, shaped by the decisions we make in this very moment. It is worth recalling that these decisions need not be monumental pronouncements to possess significance. History is forged through accumulation, the gradual establishment of habits, systems, and ideas. A civilization is not defined solely by its monuments or its leaders. It is the aggregate of innumerable individual actions performed day after day. These actions are unfolding right now, encompassing everything from our utilization of resources to our transmission of knowledge. In this sense, the present is the dynamic stratum where past and future converge, and our actions within it dictate which patterns will persist and which will transform. If we consider our era as part of a larger cyclical process, then this moment represents a crucial juncture. We have progressed sufficiently in our development to have visibly and measurably altered the planet. This places us at a point where the same pressures that may have challenged any preceding civilization, environmental constraints, energy demands, internal complexities, are now converging upon us. We have the capacity to examine our own trajectory in real time, discerning both the cautionary signals and the opportunities presented. If a method exists to extend the lifespan of a technological civilization beyond any imposed natural limit of the cycle, it is now that we must seek it. And if we are, in fact, the inaugural civilization, not part of any recurring cycle, then our choices assume even greater importance. We may be establishing the precedent for what an intelligent species is capable of achieving with a planet. This is an immense responsibility, whether we acknowledge it or not. In such a historical framework, the patterns we establish today could resonate into whatever unfolds millions of years from now. Should intelligence reemerge, we could serve as the exemplar that future minds recall, or the cautionary tale they scrutinize. The present is also the sole locus where questions pertaining to the past and future intersect. When we engage in speculation about earlier civilizations, we are, in essence, testing the boundaries of what is conceivable. Could intelligence have evolved on multiple occasions? Could technological societies have risen and fallen without leaving evident traces? These inquiries are about them, but they are also fundamentally about us. They probe whether we are part of something larger or entirely solitary, whether our challenges are unique or shared. And by actively participating in the present, we possess the advantage of being able to act upon these questions, even in the absence of definitive answers. The present is where we can construct records intended for longevity, not with the expectation that they will be universally preserved, but because we understand the inherent fragility of evidence. It is where we can determine which knowledge holds intrinsic value and how best to safeguard it. If the geological record is the sole reliable means of communication across millennia, we can intentionally shape that message rather than allowing it to be an incidental consequence of our industrial footprint. This represents a rare form of agency in the existence of a species, and one that is easily overlooked when our focus is solely on immediate concerns. Our current position in time is also a moment of profound interconnectedness. We can communicate across the globe in mere seconds, share ideas instantaneously, and coordinate efforts on a scale that no earlier society could have fathomed. This network, however, is delicate, reliant on infrastructure that would cease to function without ongoing maintenance. Yet, while it endures, it serves as a powerful tool for shaping our collective narrative. It signifies that the decisions we make today are not isolated. They propagate outward with greater speed and reach than at any other point in history. Nevertheless, despite this extensive reach and accumulated knowledge, the present remains replete with limitations. We cannot foresee every consequence of our actions. We cannot predict every climatic fluctuation, every political shift, every technological innovation or setback. We exist within a spectrum of control and uncertainty, much like every civilization that has come before us. The distinction lies in our awareness of this duality, our ability to observe ourselves, both internally and externally simultaneously. This perspective is a source of strength if utilized effectively, but a distraction if we become lost within it. To inhabit this precise moment in time entails embracing two concurrent realities: that we are transient and that we possess influence. Transient, because no species endures indefinitely, and influential, because while we are here, we have the capacity to alter the course of events. This conjunction can lead to carelessness or, conversely, to meticulousness, depending on our chosen outlook. The evidence from the deep past suggests that if we fail to maintain this equilibrium, the planet will eventually reassert its balance without our continued presence. However, it also implies that life is inherently resilient and that recovery and renewal are intrinsic aspects of its nature. Our present situation can be likened to a crossroads, the true significance of which will only become fully apparent in retrospect. Future generations, whether human or otherwise, will perceive the impact of our choices with greater clarity than we can. They will ascertain whether we extended our tenure within the cycle or prematurely curtailed it. They will know whether we bequeathed a legacy of learning or one of profound loss. For us, discerning this is more challenging, as we are immersed in the midst of the unfolding story. But such is the nature of the present. It is perpetually in flux, continually evolving into the past. And that is precisely why, even as we envision what might have transpired and what might yet occur, it is worthwhile to pause and acknowledge our current standing. The moment itself is ephemeral, yet it is also the crucible in which every decision is forged, every action undertaken, and every subtle redirection of history is set in motion. It represents the nexus where the Earth's enduring memory and the emergent possibilities of the future converge. Thank you for allowing your thoughts to accompany me on this exploration this evening. If this journey has sparked your curiosity or provided a steady foundation for contemplation, I would be delighted if you would join me for the next installment. There is always more to investigate, more quiet inquiries to pose, and more avenues through which to perceive the world anew. Until then, rest well and allow the narrative to continue within your dreams.